In October 2014, the Leeds City Council in the UK launched a pilot program called the Managed Approach. It aimed to reduce the violent crimes faced by sex workers and improve local security by allowing sex transactions to be legally conducted in specific areas and time periods. Initial data showed that violent crimes related to sex transactions indeed decreased. However, as time went by, the drawbacks of the program gradually emerged. On one hand, the legalization of sex transactions led to disorder in the community environment, severely affecting the daily lives of residents. On the other hand, the safety of sex workers was not fundamentally improved. In the end, the program had to be abandoned as a failure. So, given the many drawbacks of the program, why did the Leeds City Council still attempt to implement this seemingly trouble-prone initiative to help those who are neglected by society and living on the margins? The answer lies within the history of crime in the UK. Whether it was Jack the Ripper, the Yorkshire Ripper, or Jack the Stripper, these notorious serial killers took pleasure in hunting sex workers, creating social panic with their horrifying methods. But the tragedy of history always repeats itself. Although their active periods were in the 19th and 20th centuries, and their terror has been consigned to history, just a few years before the program was launched, Stephen Wright, known as the Suffolk Strangler, committed similar crimes. His actions eventually triggered public concerns about the safety of sex workers and a re-examination of prostitution laws. So, why did his crimes attract such widespread attention, and on what basis could he be compared to the Yorkshire Ripper, who murdered 13 victims? Unlike those serial killers who were active in the past, the answer lies in the fact that, first, his case occurred as recently as 2006. And second, Stephen, the killer himself, was also someone living on the margins of society. Before becoming a serial killer, he was a loser, with 2 broken marriages, a gambling addiction, long-term alcoholism, no career achievements, only able to wander between bars and clubs near the port and the red light district. He was not a born demon, but rather the result of a series of failures, traumas, and social struggles. On April 24, 1958, Stephen was born in the Norfolk village of Erpingham. He was the second of 4 children in his family. His father served as a military policeman, and his mother worked as a veterinary nurse. However, this seemingly stable family underwent a dramatic change in 1964 when Stephen's mother, Patricia, chose to leave home. Later, in the subsequent years of his childhood, due to his father's frequent military relocations, Stephen and his siblings were moved around like pieces of luggage, being sent to places such as Malta and Singapore. In 1978, age 20, Stephen did something that many young people do. He got married. He settled down with a girl named Angela in Wales, and they soon had a son, Michael. On the surface, it seemed Stephen was making an effort to follow a conventional path. However, the good times did not last. By 1987, when Michael was around 9 years old, Stephen and Angela decided to separate, and their marriage eventually ended in divorce. That same year, Stephen married another woman named Diane, but this marriage was even shorter-lived, lasting less than a year. Stephen's marriage to Diane also revealed an unsettling fact to everyone. Domestic violence was a common part of his relationships with women. During Stephen's marriage to Diane, neighbors often witnessed scenes of him being violent. It was said that Stephen could instantly switch from a normal conversation to choking Diane, only stopping his assault when others intervened. After divorcing Diane, the 30-year-old Stephen became the manager of a bar in Norwich. He also attempted to run another bar in South London. However, it was in London that he was exposed to and became addicted to gambling. His alcoholism also worsened, and in the end, his gambling and drinking habits cost him the opportunity to manage the bars. Entering the 1990s, due to long-term gambling and alcoholism, Stephen accumulated massive debts and declared bankruptcy. Later, his sense of hopelessness and inner pain manifested in an extreme way. In 1994 and 2000, he attempted suicide twice. Once, he tried to kill himself in his car by carbon monoxide poisoning, and the other time, he overdosed on pills. Stephen, who failed to die in both attempts, decided to take a desperate risk to repay his debts. In 2001, he stole 80 pounds and was arrested and convicted of theft. This case was Stephen's only criminal record before he committed murder. After experiencing a series of life setbacks, Stephen met his new girlfriend, a woman named Pamela. In 2004, they moved in together to a house in Ipswich and began living as a couple. By 2006, Stephen, who had once dreamed of being a chef, had been married twice, run bars, and lost everything, had finally settled into his last formal job as a forklift driver. Later, while Pamela started working night shifts and their intimate relationship almost ceased to exist, Stephen revealed his hidden nature. He began frequenting places known as massage parlors and saunas, which he knew actually provided sexual services, and his purpose was to seek those services. Stephen later admitted that he had a habit of soliciting prostitutes in his life, which began when he was young and working on a merchant ship. In this way, the man often found himself in areas filled with gray transactions and marginalized people. In the last 3 months of 2006, the concentrated period before the tragedies occurred, Stephen paid for sexual services from at least 15 women. Among them were 3 women who later became victims of his murders. On December 2, 2006, a water police officer patrolling the Belstead Brook near Hintlesham in Suffolk discovered the naked body of a young woman. The forensic examination indicated that she had not been sexually assaulted, but the cause of death could not be confirmed. Later, the victim was identified as Gemma, a 25-year-old drug user and sex worker. Gemma came from a middle-class family and had once lived a popular life. However, during her youth, she became addicted to heroin. The drug addiction caused her to lose her parents' affection and her job. In the end, unable to quit drugs, she resorted to sex work to fund her drug purchases. While the police were fully investigating this case, just 6 days later, on the 8th, another naked female body was found in the waters outside Ipswich. The victim was Tanya, a 19-year-old friend of Gemma's, who had been reported missing since October 30th. Like Gemma, she was addicted to heroin and cocaine and engaged in sex work in Ipswich's red light district to support her drug habit. Before her death, her mother still believed she was working in a hair salon. On the 10th, a member of the public discovered the third victim, 24-year-old Anneli, in a woodland by the roadside near Nacton. Her cause of death was asphyxiation, and she had been 3 months pregnant at the time of her death. In addition to her unborn child, Anneli was also a mother. Her world had collapsed at the age of 16 when she witnessed her father's death from lung cancer, after which she began using drugs. The successive discovery of female bodies put the local police on high alert. At a press conference, investigators had to issue an urgent warning for all women to stay away from Ipswich's red light district. However, this could not prevent further tragedies. On the 12th, police reluctantly announced that they had found 2 more female victims. As the investigation progressed, the identities of the 2 victims were also confirmed one by one. The first victim was 24-year-old Paula, who had gone missing on the 10th and died from compression to the throat. She was also a drug user and sex worker, and she had 3 children with her partner. Before her death, Paula told the media that, despite her fear, she had to continue working out of economic necessity. The other victim was 29-year-old Annette, the oldest of the 5 victims and also a mother, as well as a drug user and sex worker. They were found near the location where Anneli had been killed. A member of the public first discovered Paula's body, and then a police helicopter found Annette's remains nearby. At the same time, the local police formally connected these murders and launched an investigation codenamed Operation Sumac. In order to ease public pressure, the chief superintendent revealed several pieces of information at a press conference. They believed that the locations where the remains were found were merely where the remains were dumped, not the original crime scenes. He also disclosed that they had found some women's clothing and accessories discarded by the murderer, which were undergoing forensic testing. As time went on, the scale of the investigation rapidly expanded and gradually evolved into a nationwide police mobilization that attracted significant attention. The chief constable of the local police publicly declared that, based solely on their capabilities, they could no longer solve this serial murder case and had to rely on external assistance. The entire city of Ipswich, and indeed the whole of the UK, was shrouded in the terrifying shadow of the murderer. Both the public and the police knew that they had to race against time because, with each passing second, the risk of the murderer committing another crime and disappearing into the crowd increased. On the 15th, over 300 police officers were involved in the investigation, and a cumulative total of 7,300 tip-off calls from the public had been received. By the 18th, not only had the number of officers involved in the investigation increased to 650, but the number of tip-off calls from the public had also reached approximately 10,000. Meanwhile, the local police announced that they had arrested a 37-year-old man suspected of murdering all 5 women. But the real breakthrough in the case occurred on the 19th when the police arrested a second suspect, 48-year-old Stephen Wright, at a residence in Ipswich. 3 days later, following intense questioning, the local police and the Crown Prosecution Service jointly announced that they were formally charging Stephen with all 5 murders. The 37-year-old man who was initially arrested was later cleared of suspicion in the subsequent investigation. January 16, 2008, Stephen's formal trial began. The prosecution presented a tightly knit chain of evidence, while Stephen's defense was riddled with holes. He claimed that he frequently sought out sex workers and had consensual sexual encounters with all the victims except Tanya. He argued that he had intended to have sex with Tanya but changed his mind and sent her back to the red light district. This contradicted his earlier excuse when he was stopped by the police, claiming he didn't know he was in the red light district and was just driving around because he couldn't sleep. And then the judge addressed the jury, saying that the loss of 5 young lives was clearly a tragedy. You may feel sympathy for the deceased and their families, but your sympathy must not sway your judgment. You might also feel some revulsion towards their lifestyle, but no matter what drugs they used or what work they did, no one has the right to harm these women, let alone kill them. On February 21, 2008, after just 8 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Stephen guilty on all 5 counts of murder. At the sentencing, the judge stated that the murders involved a considerable degree of premeditation and planning, and therefore sentenced Stephen to life imprisonment, recommending that he never be released on parole. The conclusion of the case also brought mixed emotions to the victims' families. Paula's family expressed their outrage at the lack of the death penalty, while Gemma's father felt a glimmer of relief. It's all over now, and we can finally start to move on with our lives. Despite being sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation of never being released, Stephen did not immediately plead guilty and accept the verdict. In March 2008, he formally announced that he would appeal his conviction and sentence. His grounds for appeal were that the trial location in Ipswich had prevented him from receiving a fair trial, and he insisted that the evidence against him was insufficient for a conviction. He even wrote to the Court of Appeal, stating, "All 5 women were stripped of their clothes, jewelry, mobile phones, and bags, yet none of these items were found in his house or car." However, Stephen's resistance appeared feeble in the face of the law. His first appeal was rejected by the court in July 2008, although there were later reports that he would launch a new appeal. Eventually, in February 2009, Stephen announced that he had decided to drop all appeals. Stephen's story did not end with his imprisonment. On the contrary, as time went by, more of his crimes were uncovered. The murder of Susanna Lamplugh in July 1986, the murder of Jeanette Kempton in 1989, and the murder of Natalie Pearman in November 1992, the disappearance of Amanda Duncan in July 1993, the murder of Victoria Hall in September 1999, the disappearance of Kelly Pratt in June 2000, the murder of Vicky Glass in September 2000, and the murder of Michelle Bettles in March 2002. Among these unsolved cases, only one murder has been directly linked to Stephen so far, namely, the murder of Victoria Hall. Hall was a 17-year-old female student who went missing on her way home from a nightclub, and her body was found in a ditch 5 days after she disappeared. In 2019, after receiving new witness information, the police decided to reinvestigate the truth of Hall's death. After years of effort, on December 7, 2023, Stephen was confirmed to be the murderer of Hall and was officially charged with her murder on May 22, 2024. Although Stephen had been arrested for many years and had gone through several rounds of interrogation, his motive for the crime was never uncovered. Stephen's father, Conrad, who was 73 years old, said after hearing about Stephen's arrest that it was impossible. Stephen could not be the killer. He was too foolish, not even knowing how to kill 5 people, take them away, and dispose of their remains in different places. As for why Stephen's mother, Patricia, left home, there was a reason. She said that over time her marriage to Conrad became increasingly discordant and violent. She also tried to take Stephen with her when she left Conrad, because Stephen, under his father's strict discipline, became more and more reclusive. Mother's departure, father's discipline, stepmother's dislike, frequent moves during childhood, the inability to establish long-term friendships with people around him, and witnessing his father's violence all gradually distorted Stephen's personality. Because he had never established long-term relationships since childhood, he preferred to use violence like his father to deal with his interpersonal relationships, such as marriage and those few sex workers he had been involved with. In August 1940, the British Royal Air Force entered the airspace of Nazi Germany for the first time and bombed Berlin. Although only a wooden pavilion was destroyed, the windows of several residential buildings were shattered, and 10 people died. Berlin, the capital of Germany, still fell into extreme panic. Millions of residents took shelter in basements. That evening, Nazi authorities ordered a complete blackout in Berlin. All 65,000 gas lamps were turned off. 1,200 arc mercury lamps were removed, and all residents were required to cover their windows with thick black cloth. From sunset until sunrise the next day, anyone who exposed any artificial light source would face a fine for the first offense, imprisonment for the second, and immediate execution by firing squad for the third. For example, on the evening of November 8, 1941, a brewery owner in Pankow, Berlin, shone a flashlight out the window to check the boiler. After being discovered by the patrol and failing to turn off the light, he was executed 15 days later. On April 3, 1942, a 17-year-old girl in Spandau, Berlin, was using a candle on the roof to write a letter to her boyfriend at the front line. After being discovered by the patrol, she was also sentenced to death. However, although the blackout measures were implemented, factories in Berlin still operated on a 2-shift or even 3-shift system, with the afternoon shift workers working until 10 o'clock in the evening. After finishing their shift, because of the blackout, these workers had to make their way home in complete darkness, with no lights at all. However, darkness meant the perfect opportunity for crime. No one would see the attacker's face, and no one would notice the attack. October 4, 1940, an ordinary Friday evening, Gertrude Ditter, a 20-year-old woman, was found dead. Her husband was a soldier fighting on the front line. 2 months later, on the morning of December 5th, 2 crime scenes were discovered simultaneously. The first victim was Elfriede Frank, who was found near the embankment of the Suburban Express Railway. Subsequent forensic reports indicated that her skull had been shattered by a blunt instrument, with extensive abrasions and comminuted fractures on her body. Clearly, she had been attacked and killed while on her way home by train, and then thrown off the train. The other victim was Irmgard Fries, a 19-year-old woman, whose body was found not far from her home. Fries had been raped and beaten to death. Shortly after, on December 22nd, the body of the 4th victim, Elizabeth, was discovered by several railway workers. Her fate was the same as Elfriede's. She had suffered severe blows to the head and was thrown off the train, with extensive abrasions and comminuted fractures on her body. 6 days later, on the morning of December 28, 1940, the Berlin police found Gertrude Siewert, who was severely injured near the railway embankment. She was the first victim who had been attacked but did not die immediately. However, despite being urgently taken to the hospital, she eventually died from her severe injuries due to inadequate medical conditions and the prolonged exposure of her wounds. Meanwhile, the Berlin police officially combined the 5 murder cases in an internal report, as all the victims were women, murdered during the blackout period, and 3 of them had skull fractures and were thrown from moving trains. However, at that time, Nazi Germany had already launched World War II. In order not to affect the morale of the rear supply personnel and the soldiers on the front line, the Nazi government ordered the media and journalists not to report any information about the serial murders. Berlin police were also not allowed to publicly seek information about the serial murders or warn the public of the dangers of traveling by suburban express train at night. Unable to openly inquire about clues regarding the attacker, the Berlin police could only conduct their investigation under the guise of internal security consolidation, a method that was both slow and time-consuming. In addition to this, the Berlin police assigned 2 plainclothes officers to each train carriage. Female officers would disguise themselves as factory workers, nurses, or postal workers. And if there were not enough female officers, male officers would even cross-dress to blend in. In reality, this sting operation failed to catch the attacker, but the officers on stackout ended up arresting some individuals who had committed minor offenses instead. January 5, 1941, Hedwig A. Bauer, 5 months pregnant, was found unconscious near the embankment of the Suburban Express Railway. Like Seward, she had been attacked and thrown from the train. Unfortunately, later that evening, Hedwig died in the hospital from her severe injuries. But, before her death, the clue she provided perfectly matched what Seward had said, that their attacker was a railway worker dressed in a black uniform. Initially, Seward's statement had not attracted the police's attention, as it could have been mistaken. However, Hedwig's words confirmed the authenticity of this lead. At that time, Berlin had 2 million male residents, and only 8,000 of them were railway workers. So, from this point on, the police could finally narrow down their investigation without wasting a lot of time and manpower on other areas. Soon after, on February 11th, the body of the 7th victim, Johanna Voigt, was discovered. In the following 5 months, the police were questioning railway workers. Since they were not allowed to disclose information about the murders, their investigation progress was very slow. By June, out of the 8,000 railway workers, only a little over 5,000 had been questioned. In addition, the attacker did not commit another crime for 4 months after killing Johanna, until July 3, 1941, when he struck again. This time, the victim was 35-year-old Frida Koziol, the 8th and final victim. Meanwhile, several railway workers approached the police, saying that one of their colleagues, a man named Paul Ogorzow, had been acting very strangely over the past 2 years. Paul was a seemingly ordinary, average-height, short-haired white man. Initially, he was a capable and trustworthy colleague. However, he now often made misogynistic remarks, talked about his fascination with murder, and during work hours, he would always leave his post, climb over the warehouse fence, and disappear into the night. Later, when questioned about his absences, Paul claimed that he was sneaking out to meet a mistress whose husband was a soldier. After receiving this information, Wilhelm Ludke, the head of the homicide department of the Berlin police, personally examined Paul's uniform. He found numerous small brown stains on the cuffs of Paul's uniform jackets and the inner sides of the trouser legs. On July 12, 1941, the police arrested Paul, and the interrogation took place in a small room with only a single light bulb due to the blackout restrictions. During the interrogation, Wilhelm placed the X-rays and the skulls of 2 victims on the table, indicating to Paul that they had sufficient evidence. In the end, Paul admitted his crimes, but attributed his violent actions to his long-term alcohol abuse, and blamed his drinking on a Jewish doctor who had failed to cure his gonorrhea. Attempting to deflect responsibility and align with Nazi anti-Semitic narratives. Hearing these, Wilhelm did not buy it, instead attributing Paul's motives to excessive sexual impulses, an attraction to resistance, pathological misogyny, and not related to racial revenge. The court also rejected the claim of medical malpractice and concluded the case as a common criminal serial murder. The S-Bahn murderer Paul Ogorzow was not only a railway worker but also an ardent Nazi. Born in September 1912 in the village of Montau in East Prussia, he was the illegitimate child of a farm worker named Marie, and he never met his father. Age 12, he was adopted by a farmer from Havelland. Over time, he first worked as a farmhand in the village of Nauen, then moved to a foundry in Brandenburg an der Havel, and later relocated to Berlin. In there, young Paul joined the Nazi Party and subsequently the Nazi Party's paramilitary organization, the Sturmabteilung. The Sturmabteilung's membership largely consisted of veterans, unemployed youths, and malcontents. It was a quasi-military violent group and the Nazi Party's enforcers, intervening in elections, engaging in street violence and intimidation, and disrupting opponents' rallies. The Sturmabteilung played a significant role in Hitler's rise to power. Before his arrest, Paul was a squad leader in the Sturmabteilung. In 1934, Paul was employed by the Deutsche Reichsbahn, working as a track layer in the suburban express railway system in Berlin. Soon after, he was promoted to assistant signalman at the Ruhleben marshalling yard. located in the eastern suburbs of Berlin near Karlshorst, which also became the area where Paul committed most of his crimes. In 1937, Paul married Gertrude Ziegelman, a female saleswoman 2 years his senior, and the couple had one son and one daughter, living in an apartment in Karlshorst. Usually, neighbors would see Paul tending to cherry trees in the small garden and playing with his children in the alleyways. However, these were all part of his disguise. For example, during the trial, his wife testified that he was suspicious and violent, often beating her and repeatedly accusing her of infidelity without any basis. After his arrest, Paul made a systematic and detailed confession to the police, enabling the investigators to reconstruct his criminal trajectory. In late August 1939, Paul was still living in Karlshorst. After the outbreak of World War II, Friedrichsfeld and its surrounding areas became a well-known widow's street. Most of the men in that area had been conscripted into the army, leaving only women behind, and thus Paul targeted that area. He specifically targeted lone housewives and committed a total of 31 rape and robbery cases. During the attacks, he would either strangle the victims, threaten them with a knife, or beat them with a club. In the statements of the victims, all mentioned that the attacker was wearing a railway worker's uniform. In fact, he also made many murder attempts and gradually perfected his modus operandi through these attempts. From August 1939 to July 1940, Paul attacked and stabbed 3 women on 3 separate occasions, but he was unsuccessful in killing them. In August 1940, due to the power outages, female workers would take the train home, and so Paul chose the vicinity of trains and stations as his crime locations. In mid-August, Paul raped and beat a woman inside a train carriage. However, due to his inexperience, he mistakenly thought the woman was dead and left the scene. In September, he strangled another victim unconscious and threw her off a moving train, but she still survived. His most embarrassing attack occurred near a station when he attempted to rape a woman. Unbeknownst to him, the woman's husband and brother-in-law were waiting for her not far away. In the end, Paul was severely beaten and almost taken to the police station. Later, based on the experiences of his multiple failures, he completely refined his method of operation and began his career as a murderer. On July 24, 1941, Paul Ogorzow, known as the S-Bahn murderer, was sentenced to death by the higher regional court in Berlin. Additionally, fearing that the scandal would affect the morale of soldiers on the front lines, the Nazi authorities had expelled Paul from the Nazi Party several days before he was charged and immediately declared him a public enemy, because no soldier would want his woman to be attacked, especially if the attacker was a member of the Nazi Party. Only 1 day elapsed between the death sentence and its execution. On July 26th, Paul was executed by guillotine in the prison. In the late 19th century, a mysterious killer emerged in British society. Within just 3 months, he committed 5 brutal murders in a row. All 5 victims had their throats slit, and in several cases, their abdominal organs were even removed. Due to the backwardness of criminal investigation technology and the lack of experience in dealing with serial killers, the British police never solved the case. Later, the mysterious killer was called Jack the Ripper, and his case became one of the most famous and mysterious unsolved cases in history. In those days, on the other side of the Atlantic, Mexico also had a cold-blooded serial killer, Francisco Guerrero Pérez, known as the Mexican Ripper. Since he is the first recorded serial killer in Mexico, the Mexican media often compares him to Jack the Ripper. However, in reality, Francisco's criminal activities predated Jack the Ripper. His modus operandi was even more brutal and complex, involving rape, torture, strangulation, throat slitting, and in some cases, decapitation of the victims. Moreover, Francisco was labeled as a born criminal by psychologists of that time. But is that really the case? In 1840, in the Mexican region of Bajío, a poor family welcomed their 11th child, Francisco. From as far back as Francisco could remember, the shadow of life had tightly enveloped him. In those days, Mexico's economic situation was extremely dire, with meager incomes for ordinary families. Due to poverty, food in the household was extremely scarce, and he was constantly in a state of hunger and malnutrition. His father's departure further stripped this fragile family of its last support. And the pressures of life caused Francisco's mother to lose her patience and gentleness, made she often vented her anger on the children, especially on Francisco. Beating, strangulation, and slaps, these acts of violence were something Francisco endured several times a day. Later, in 1862, 22-year-old Francisco, driven by the desire to change his fate, set off alone for Mexico City, the capital of Mexico. In there, he found work as a cobbler and settled in the Paralvillo neighborhood, where he met Maria, a gentle woman. Not long after, the two quickly fell in love, got married, and had 4 children together. In the late 19th century, Mexico was ruled by a man named Porfirio Diaz. He was the longest-serving president in Mexican history and a well-known dictator in Latin America. During his rule, between 1880 and 1888, a disturbing series of murders happened. Along the banks of the Consulado River, which flows through the valley of Mexico City, numerous female corpses were found. Most of the victims had been decapitated, brutally beaten, and even dismembered, with their identities often unrecognizable. Among the known victims were Candelaria Garcia, Francisca Rivero, Maria Martinez, Margarita Rosas, Maria Lopez, Soledad Gonzalez, Maria Villagran, Josefa Rodriguez, Maria Munoz, Mirza Gallardo, and the killer of these heinous crimes was referred to in Spanish as the Consulado River Ripper. February 13, 1888, Francisco was arrested after being reported by several neighbors. The neighbors accused him of killing a poor woman engaged in prostitution, Gallardo. In early 1888, Gallardo was raped and had her throat slit, and her body was found along the banks of the Consulado River. According to witnesses, the last time she was seen alive was with Francisco. Before his arrest, Francisco had even boasted about his crimes in a tavern. He unashamedly claimed to have killed many prostitutes and believed he was contributing to society. In the past, Francisco always proudly declared himself a devout Catholic, having served as an altar boy in his childhood and attended to the Virgin of Guadalupe. However, his actions bore no resemblance to those of a religious person. He always dressed himself meticulously, wearing luxurious and elegant attire, soft cashmere trousers, exquisite charro vests, and well-tailored jackets, with colorful sashes around his waist. And his private life was extremely chaotic, with numerous mistresses and many illegitimate children. After Francisco's arrest, a woman named Amelia bravely stepped forward to publicly accuse Francisco of raping and attempting to murder her. Amelia was a hard-working laundress, and though her life was difficult, she always strived to maintain her dignity and hope. One morning in 1888, Amelia returned from a pilgrimage to La Santísima village near the town of Guadalupe. With a devout heart, she hoped that the Virgin's protection would bring her some solace. However, as she walked through the riverbank bush, Francisco suddenly appeared, dragged her to ground, and brutally assaulted her like a beast, trying to take her life. Fortunately, Francisco, thinking she was dead, left her by the riverbank and fled in haste. Initially, Porfirio's authoritarian regime attempted to censor and suppress news reports about the Consulado River Ripper. In those days, media freedom was severely restricted. The government was extremely sensitive to any news that might cause social unrest. But the Consulado River's crimes were just too brutal, and the news spread like wildfire throughout Mexico City. By the time Francisco was apprehended, the media frenzy was unstoppable, and his name quickly became the focus of everyone's discussion in Mexico City. In the end, Francisco was convicted of murdering Gallardo and assaulting Amelia. As for the rest of his crimes, they could not be prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. According to the laws at the time, Francisco should have been sentenced to death, but Porfirio personally overturned this verdict, sentencing Francisco to only 20 years in prison. In 1904, Francisco was pardoned and released early on the grounds of alleged wrongful conviction. After his release, he did not repent but became even more brazen. On June 13, 1908, he was arrested again. At this time, Francisco was accused of murdering an elderly woman. It was claimed that his motive for killing her was simply that the old woman had engaged in certain actions that indirectly angered him. Moreover, although the victim was called Antonia, her identity was not fully confirmed. As for why Francisco was arrested, it was due to his carelessness. At the time of the crime, a boy named Jose was herding by the river. After hearing the old woman's screams, he quietly approached and hid in the bush, witnessing the entire process of her being raped and murdered. There were also 2 girls at the scene who saw Francisco standing a few meters away from the crime scene, washing the blood from his arms, face, and chest with river water. Later, a journalist who had previously reported on the crimes of the Consulado River Ripper noticed the similarities between Antonia's murder and the murders committed by Francisco. So he immediately confirmed the situation with the 3 witnesses and reported Francisco's crimes to the police together with them. This time, Francisco's arrest did not cause much of a sensation, but his trial attracted the attention of over 2,000 spectators. He was found guilty of murdering Antonia and was sentenced to death once again. Meanwhile, a woman named Lorenza Arrusi also published a vivid account of an assault by Francisco. According to her statement, she first encountered Francisco near the railway in the Peralvillo neighborhood. It was an ordinary evening, and she was hurrying along when Francisco approached her under the pretext of borrowing a light for his cigarette. However, as she handed him the match, Francisco suddenly pulled out a knife and threatened her to accompany him to a nearby spot for a conversation. At that moment, despite being extremely terrified, Lorenza did not lose her composure. She cleverly lied that she needed to get some money, deceiving Francisco and narrowly escaping. However, 2 months later, she encountered Francisco again. At that time, she was not so fortunate. Francisco took her to a cave far from the residential area. There, he raped and tortured her for nearly 2 days, trampling her dignity and humanity into the ground. Fortunately, when Francisco left for a moment to buy pulkai, a fermented wine, she seized the opportunity and fled the cave with all her might. In the days leading up to his execution, Francisco was transferred to the Lecumberri prison. The prison's towering walls and iron bars became the final resting place for his crimes. Inside his cell, he seemed to find a peculiar solace. Most of his time was spent reading a novel by a French author, Paul and Virginia. This work, which depicts innocent love and a beautiful life, formed a stark contrast to his dark past. Perhaps, in that fictional world constructed by words, Francisco found a fleeting and illusory sense of peace. In November 1910, as the flames of the Mexican Revolution were just beginning to ignite, Francisco's life also came to an end. There were conflicting reports about the cause of his death. Some claimed he died of tuberculosis, while others believed that typhoid fever triggered his physical collapse. There were even speculations that he suffered severe contusions after an accident, which ultimately led to his demise. Despite the various theories, the only confirmed pathological sign was cerebral embolism. At the time, Francisco was found unconscious in his cell and was urgently taken to Juarez Hospital, but he never woke up again. In the late 19th century, the field of criminology was dominated by the theories of Cesare Lombroso, an Italian criminologist. Lombrosso's theory posited that born criminals were the product of specific lower-class groups in society. According to him, the ancestors of these criminals gradually degenerated in certain environments and deviated from humanity, becoming almost animal-like. He believed that born criminals typically came from impoverished backgrounds, were illiterate, had poor personal hygiene, crude manners, low intelligence, dark complexions, robust physiques, and rugged, almost simian-like facial features. Against this theoretical backdrop, criminologist Carlos Rumaniak asserted that Francisco was a born criminal. In his 1906 report, he pointed out that the existing evidence was insufficient to infer that Francisco committed his crimes under the irresistible drive of sexual perversion or out of morbid obsession, but rather due to violent factors. He believed that Francisco's criminal acts were the result of violent and conscious impulses, and that he was essentially a morally corrupt individual who had succumbed to violent depravity. However, modern criminological theories have provided a deeper understanding of Francisco's criminal psychology. Modern research indicates that he was not a born criminal, but rather the result of a combination of factors, including physiological, psychological, social, and environmental influences. His criminal psychology was likely rooted in the trauma he experienced during his childhood. His early years were marked by his mother's rejection and violence, and he never had a positive father figure, or the father figure he had represented violence against women. These painful experiences planted the seeds of hatred in his heart, which eventually evolved into an intractable Oedipus complex. He projected the image of his mother onto his victims, as if by assaulting them, he was also taking revenge on the mother who had abused him in his childhood. Moreover, Francisco was not a crude or intellectually deficient person. On the contrary, he was well-mannered and even polite. And his modus operandi was also highly organized, demonstrating that he was not a simple violent offender. Francisco never expressed any remorse for his actions. He was a person lacking the most basic empathy, with no guilt or compassion in his heart. Even until he took his last breath, he never expressed any remorse for his crimes. His life, like the crimes he committed, was filled with darkness and enigma. His death, like his life, was fraught with controversy and unsolved mysteries. The last serial killer to be executed by hanging in Washington state, Charles Campbell. In 1976, he was imprisoned for an assault and sodomy crime, sentenced to 40 years in prison. However, 6 years later, driven by a strong desire for revenge, he exploited a loophole in the judicial system to carry out a meticulously planned triple murder. As for whether God will forgive Charles, no one knows. But the human court has already given a fitting answer. Even his own parents said that executing Charles was the only way to ensure he would never harm anyone again. So why did Charles become a heartless, conscienceless man who resorted to violence to solve everything, even said he would try to harm anyone who got close to him? The root of the problem lies in his childhood and adolescence. October 21st, 1954, Charles was born into an ordinary family on Oahu Island, Hawaii. But the family life was far from harmonious. His father was a Marine influenced by both alcohol and war memories, and his mother was equally fond of drinking. So the house was always filled with the smell of alcohol and the sound of quarrels, and Charles often witnessed his father's domestic violence against his mother. A psychological report in 1982 showed that Charles had complex feelings towards his father. He admired his father's behavior while thinking his mother was weak and overly controlling. This distorted perception is a manifestation of the chaos and contradictions deep in his heart. Age 13, Charles was exposed to alcohol and drugs, such as amphetamines and heroin. October 29, 1970, 8 days after his 16th birthday, his father reported to the police that he had stolen the family car. In July 1971, his mother reported him to the police for running away from home. However, she also publicly declared that she had given up on Charles and would not worry about his running away, preferring that he never return home. The next day, Charles was arrested by the police. At that time, he had also broken into his grandparents' home, stealing several firearms in an attempt to raise travel funds to go to California. For stealing his grandparents' guns, Charles was detained at the Green Hill School in Chehalis between 1971 and 1972. There, he revealed his strong, vengeful nature and ability to bide his time. At that time, Charles was seen as a rebellious student. However, only a few people who had paid attention to Charles understood his personality. His former tutor said that he was a student who was easily overlooked. The school's principal, Williams, stated that he was a truly cold-blooded individual, claiming that he would harm anyone who got close to him. Apparently, Charles had developed antisocial tendencies during this period. In August 1973, Charles left Green Hill School, and soon after he chose to get married. In his family life, he, like his father, always inflicted domestic violence on his wife. But his behavior was more severe. He even threatened to kill several of her family members and her dog. Their daughter was born in March 1974, but 20-year-old Charles was completely unable to take on the responsibilities of a father. He would often become angry at the sound of his daughter's crying and once even threw a butcher knife at her. Because of this incident, in August 1974, his wife chose to divorce him and took their daughter with her. The departure of his wife and daughter left Charles without an outlet for his emotions, and ultimately, he embarked on his criminal career. On December 11, 1974, winter day in Clearview, Washington, Renee Wickland was doing gardening at her doorstep, and her daughter, Shanna, only a few months old, was sleeping soundly. Suddenly, Charles approached Renee from behind. Before she could react, a knife was already pressed against her throat. Charles threatened Renee with the knife, demanding that she perform oral sex on him and said menacingly, "If you don't cooperate, I'll kill your daughter." In order to protect her daughter, she reluctantly succumbed. After the assault, Charles hurriedly left, and Renee collapsed to the ground, trembling as she dialed the emergency number and reported everything to the police. 2 years later, Charles was finally arrested for the case. Before his arrest, no one knew what he had been doing in these 2 years. Standing in court, Charles claimed his innocence, but Renee and her neighbor Barbara testified in detail about the assault. Barbara also described Renee's psychological state after the attack. She stated that after the incident, Renee had a vacant look in her eyes, as if she had lost her soul. She also separated from her husband Jack and took on the responsibility of raising her daughter Shanna alone. In order to make a living, she worked as an accountant from home and helped students obtain loans for beauty school. She tried to get her and her daughter's life back on track, but the inner wounds were hard to heal. On May 11, 1976, Charles was sentenced to a total of 40 years in prison for 3 counts, including the assault and sodomy of Renee, as well as an unrelated 1976 burglary. He was incarcerated in a reformatory in Washington state. However, he never followed the rules there. He stole yeast from the kitchen to illegally brew homemade alcohol, assaulted other inmates multiple times, and more shockingly, raped at least 2 fellow prisoners, threatening to kill them if they reported to the prison authorities. In addition, he had an inappropriate relationship with a female prison counselor who abused drugs and had a son with her. In January 1979, a prison psychologist conducted a psychological reevaluation of Charles. The results of the reevaluation were not surprising at all. Charles was prone to conflict, exhibited multiple antisocial tendencies, disregarded the feelings of others. The psychological report also noted that Charles was indifferent to others, lacked a conscience, and maliciously could not tolerate the social order that had imprisoned him. He posed an imminent danger to anyone who directly or indirectly attracted his attention or interest. However, despite Charles' repeated violations of prison discipline and disturbing psychological evaluations, the Washington State Parole Board waived his mandatory sentence in June 1981. And this decision also made Charles eligible to be downgraded to a minimum security custody status, awaiting a parole hearing date in May 1983. In October 1981, Charles was placed in the Monroe Reformatory in Washington state, which was established to help prisoners gradually reintegrate into society, but he did not cherish this opportunity. Sometime between December 25, 1981 and January 4, 1982, his ex-wife accused Charles of raping her. Later, Charles committed 4 further disciplinary offenses. On April 14, 1982, Renee was sick and confined to bed. Her 8-year-old daughter, Shanna, was sitting by her side, keeping her company. Around 4:20 in the afternoon, Renee's neighbor Barbara came to her house with a concerned heart. 2 hours later, around 6:30 in the evening, Barbara's husband, Donald, arrived at Renee's house. He just wanted to see his wife and say hello to Renee. However, as soon as he pushed open the door to Renee's house, the scene in front of him shocked him instantly, followed by uncontrollable horror and grief, because the remains of Renee, Shanna, and Barbara were scattered in different rooms of the house. Barbara's throat was slashed. Renee's head, back, and chest were severely beaten. Her jaw and nose were broken. There were marks of strangulation on her neck, and there were signs of sexual assault. Shanna's neck was cut so deeply that she was almost decapitated, with an extremely severe blood loss of up to 95%. After the incident, the investigators carefully examined the crime scene. They found a drinking cup with a bloodied fingerprint. And one of Renee's neighbors provided an important clue to the police. She had seen a man walking around Renee's yard in a suspicious manner with a knife that morning, as if he was looking for an opportunity. Other neighbors also saw him walking towards the house with a large roll of blanket. When the police questioned Donald, he said that the only person he could think of as the possible murderer was the man who had attacked Renee 8 years ago. Meanwhile, a fellow work-release prisoner of Charles provided a crucial clue to the police. He told the police that on the evening of April 14th, he and Charles had been to a place by the Snohomish River and noticed Charles secretly throwing some items into the river. Based on this clue, the police quickly organized a dive team to search the river. Eventually, they retrieved several pieces of clothing, accessories, and jewelry from the river, On April 19th, Charles was arrested at the Monroe Reformatory and charged with first-degree murder. Dried blood was found on the door handle of his car, and Shanna's earrings were discovered on the back seat. In November 1982, the courtroom in Washington state was filled with a somber atmosphere as a life-or-death trial was underway. In the defendant's seat, Charles remained silent, refusing to testify on his own behalf and declining to discuss the shocking murder case. Meanwhile, witnesses for the prosecution successively took the stand. The female prison counselor, who was Charles's girlfriend at the time, also testified. She said that Charles harbored considerable resentment towards Renee and had driven past her house several times during his work release period. The defense attorneys appeared somewhat powerless during the trial. They did not call any witnesses or present any evidence, but instead repeatedly emphasized that this case was a miscarriage of justice. In addition, many residents signed a petition demanding the death penalty for Charles. In the end, after careful consideration, the jury agreed with the citizens' demands. They believed that Charles showed no remorse for the murders of Renee, Shanna, and Barbara. Throughout the trial, he mostly remained calm and spoke little. Even when the crime scene and autopsy photos were displayed in the courtroom, he did not show much obvious emotion. On November 26, 1982, after several days of trial, the jury ultimately found Charles guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. On December 17th, the judge formally sentenced him to death. Since Charles was unwilling to discuss the details of the murders, investigators could only roughly piece together the sequence of events on April 14th. Apparently, driven by hatred, Renee was likely the first victim to be attacked. Shanna was found lying in the next bedroom. Investigators believe Charles may have shown the girl her mother's body before slitting her throat to amplify her fear. When Barbara entered Renee's house, Renee and Shanna were probably already dead. Upon witnessing the horrific scene, Barbara attempted to flee but crossed paths with Charles and was ultimately killed as well. During his time on death row, Charles's mother expressed conflicting emotions. She stated that she still loved him, yet simultaneously supported the death penalty. She once claimed Charles had engaged in sexual relations with a pet dog he had adopted, and upon learning of his first-degree murder arrest, she told investigators, "I never believed he would end up anywhere but in the electric chair." Charles's father and siblings made no public appearances or statements. In 1982, a Seattle psychiatrist conducted a psychological evaluation of Charles. In his report, he confirmed Charles showed no signs of brain damage but held an unorthodox, antisocial perception of reality. Charles told him, "The world made me. I can do whatever I want. There is no right or wrong, and no one can tell me what to do." This twisted worldview was the root of his criminal path. In 1994, after a decade of repeated appeals and delays, Charles's execution was finally scheduled for May 27, 1994. In the 24 hours leading up to the execution, Charles' biological parents and siblings did not visit him, nor did his ex-wife. The last people he saw were his girlfriend, his son, and the female prison counselor who had given birth to his child. On the day of the execution, Charles's witnesses included 12 journalists from various media outlets, 3 relatives of the victims' families, the Snohomish County prosecutor, and his attorney. Due to fear, Charles had great difficulty walking, and standing guards had to strap him to a wooden board and carry him to the gallows. At 12 minutes past midnight, the trapdoor was opened, and 6 minutes later, he was dead. Additionally, in Washington state, death row inmates were given the choice between lethal injection and hanging, but hanging was the default method of execution. If an inmate refused to choose, hanging would be their ultimate fate. Charles was one such inmate who refused to make a choice, so his method of execution was defaulted to hanging. Charles also wrote a letter to the governor of Washington state. In the letter, he referred to himself as both a victim and a defendant, requesting a face-to-face meeting in the hope that the governor would observe his sincerity, frankness, and demeanor. However, the governor of Washington state denied his request. After the execution, no one claimed Charles's body. As per regulations, his body was cremated. When prison staff cleaned out Charles's cell afterward, they found a 4-inch piece of metal. He had been sharpening it, though it was unclear whether it was for suicide, fighting, or an escape attempt. The story did not end with Charles's death. In reality, Even though he had killed 3 people, he was not considered a serial killer until 2023, when an unsolved murder case was linked to him. This murder took place in 1975, 5 months after Charles assaulted Renee. Hallie Ann Seaman was an outstanding student at the University of Washington, just 2 semesters away from earning her master's degree in architecture. Friends described her as a smart, strong-willed, and athletic young woman, yet her life was tragically cut short on the evening of April 29, 1975. She was last seen sitting at a drawing table in the University of Washington's architecture building, intently studying how to design quality low-income housing. The next afternoon, a man discovered Hallie's body hidden in the bushes at the edge of the parking lot on the east side of Eastlake Avenue during his lunch break. Seattle police quickly arrived at the scene, and after questioning nearby students, learned that within 40 minutes of Hallie leaving the architecture building, a witness had seen a man loading an unconscious or comatose woman into a white vehicle near the intersection. Consequently, they confirmed that hours earlier, Hallie had been abducted to an unknown location, sexually assaulted, and repeatedly stabbed. Her vehicle was later set on fire 4 miles south of where her body was discovered. This case shocked the entire campus and community, but the perpetrator seemed to vanish into thin air, never to be found. It wasn't until nearly 50 years later that technological advances and a serendipitous discovery brought the true culprit to light. Given Hallie's youth and the seemingly random nature of her murder, the case had lingered in the minds of the Seattle Police Department. For years, they worked diligently to uncover clues. In 2002, an officer submitted forensic evidence preserved from Hallie's autopsy to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. Unfortunately, there was no match in existing databases. By the time a police officer named Norton took up the case, modern technology had introduced genetic genealogy, a technique that infers familial relationships and family history by analyzing genetic information. This technology has been widely used in serial killer investigations in recent years, such as the Golden State Killer and Gilgo Beach serial murders, so he decided to employ it and submitted the perpetrator's DNA. In August 2023, Norton received an email from a forensic scientist at the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. The content revealed that the test results linked Charles to Hallie. Although Charles would never be held accountable for Hallie's murder, it meant that the identity of her killer would no longer be a mystery. Lake Elsinore in Riverside County has a popular hiking trail called the Walker Canyon Trail, and it is a paradise for hikers. From this trail into Walker Canyon can enjoy the all views of Lake Elsinore and the San Jacinto Mountains. However, on June 28, 1989, the tranquility there was shattered by a murder case. Kimberly Little, a 28-year-old known sex worker and drug user, was found lying near Walker Canyon Trail. Little's body was covered with a blue bath towel and was covered in bruises. The autopsy report indicated that she had suffered a severe blow to the head and had cigarette burns on her arms and other parts of her body. Several months later, December 13th, a similarly heinous tragedy occurred in Quail Valley. 23-year-old Christina Leal was found lying on a hillside and lifeless. After the forensic pathologist carefully examined Christina's body, the autopsy report revealed that Christina had obvious binding marks on her wrists and ankles. Her face had deep scratches, and one of her eyes was blackened from a blow. There were 4 stab wounds in the center of her chest, with part of one breast being severed, and her genitals also had at least 2 stab wounds. Most horrifyingly, the forensic pathologist discovered that the person who killed Christina had forcibly inserted a light bulb into her vagina. Those pieces of evidence indicate that before her death, Christina had been bound and subjected to extremely brutal torture by the killer. Since the crime scenes of both Lytle and Christina were near Lake Elsinore, and despite the different times of the crimes, the police were almost certain that the same killer was responsible for both murders. Given that Lytle was a sex worker and drug user, Christina also had a record of arrests for drug use and prostitution. It appeared that the mysterious killer had a clear animosity towards sex workers or drug users. In early spring of 1990, Riverside County was once again the scene of a brutal murder case. January 18th, Darla Ferguson, 23-year-old, became the victim of this murder case. Her body was found just half a mile away from where Little's body had been found. When found, her upper body was wrapped in a garbage bag, with her waist tightly bound by a rope, and her body showed clear signs of blunt force trauma. Just 1 month later, February 9, 1990, in Highgrove, near Lake Elsinore, 35-year-old Carol Miller was found dead in a grapefruit orchard. When found, she was naked except for a shirt pulled over her head. She also had 5 fatal stab wounds on her body. 4 murders plunged the community into a state of fear, as residents struggled to imagine that a brutal demon was lurking in their side. Meanwhile, the Riverside County Police were working tirelessly to uncover the truth. Finally, they did discover clues related to the serial murders. As early as before Little's murder, there was a sex worker had suffered a similar attack. On the night of January 10, 1989, Rhonda Jetmore, 27-year-old, was, as usual, on the street looking for clients. And it wasn't not long before she encountered a male client who requested that the sexual transaction take place in a dark alley. Apparently, this was not an unusual request, as everyone has different sexual preferences. However, during the transaction, the client suddenly grabbed her by the neck, saying that he needed some excitement, but his grip grew increasingly tighter. Fearing for her safety, Rhonda quickly retrieved a flashlight from her handbag and struck the client's head with it, allowing her to briefly break free from his control. However, the client did not give up. He pushed Rhonda to the ground, tore at her clothes, and forced his fingers into her mouth. In a moment of desperation, Rhonda bit down hard on his fingers with all her strength. Although one of her teeth was broken, fortunately, the client also stepped back due to the injury. Seizing the opportunity, Rhonda ran to the street and waved and shouted at a car. The driver of the car was someone who specifically protected Rhonda and carried a handgun. Hearing Rhonda's cries for help, he decisively pulled out his gun and fired at the client, who was not far behind Rhonda. In the end, Rhonda was survived, and the client fled the scene of the attack. Although the police questioned Rhonda for some details, unfortunately, due to her fear and the fact that the transaction took place in a dark alley, Rhonda did not remember or could not describe the client's features. Later on November 6, 1990, the body of Cheryl Coker, aged 33, was discovered. Parts of her body were discarded on an abandoned road, while other parts were hidden inside a trash bin. On December 21st, 27-year-old Susan Sternfeld was found dead. She had been posed by the killer in a sexually suggestive manner, and her cause of death was strangulation. On January 19th, 42-year-old Kathleen Nolan's body was found in a landfill near Lake Elsinore, with a white sock stuffed down her throat. July 4th, Sherry Latham, 37-year-old, was found dead, lying face down and naked on the shore of Lake Elsinore. 1 month later, on August 16th, the body of Kelly Hammond was found in an alley in Corona. Her death pose was extremely peculiar. Her right arm was bent and tucked under her abdomen. Her left arm was bent with her hand on the ground and palm facing up. Her left leg was drawn up to her chest, and her right leg was extended outward. September 13th, another murder occurred in Riverside County. A black woman, 30-year-old Catherine McDonald, was the only black victim in the series of murders. Unlike the other victims, her death meant the loss of 2 lives, as the autopsy report revealed that she was 4 months pregnant. Similarly, McDonald had been subjected to brutal torture. The killer had cut a piece of flesh from her neck, stabbed her chest 3 times, partially severed her right breast, and inflicted stab and tear wounds on her genitals. On October 30th, the body of 35-year-old Delia Zamora was found. Although the exact method of the crime could not be confirmed, her manner of death shocked both the police and the forensic pathologists, as her throat had been crushed and broken in half. In the winter of 1991, December 23rd, 39-year-old Eleanor Casares was found in an orange grove near the intersection of Jefferson Street and Victoria Avenue in Riverside. This murder case was also the last one committed by the killer because he was about to be arrested. January 9th, 1992. What was supposed to be an ordinary day in Riverside County with no new murders turned out to be a pivotal moment in the entire case. As usual, the police were patrolling the streets, checking vehicles suspected of violations. During this time, a man named William Suff was pulled over. William was a warehouse clerk in Riverside County, and during the serial murders, he had transported office furniture for the members of the task force investigating the serial murders. A police officer, as a routine check, inspected Williams' trunk and discovered a blood-stained knife and some evidence allegedly related to the serial murders. Although his silence made the interrogation difficult, the police had already gathered sufficient physical evidence and witness testimonies. On July 19, 1995, in the courtroom of Riverside County, after careful deliberation, the jury found William guilty of 12 murders and the attempted murder of a woman, Rhonda. During the trial, William remained silent and did not testify in his own defense. Later, at the sentencing phase, the prosecutor submitted additional evidence to the court, linking William to a murder that occurred in San Bernardino, and this revealed that William's killings did not begin in 1989, but even earlier. In reality, William's violent behavior can be traced back to September 1973, when his wife, Terrell, fearing his beatings, left home with their daughter, Dejiania. But when the judge dealt with the custody issue, he granted custody of Dejiania to William, who was known to abuse his daughter. On September 25th, William, as he did on many other days, began to beat Dejiania. Unable to control his anger, he inflicted brutal violence on the 2-month-old infant. Ultimately, Dejiania was killed by William's abuse. This murder marked the beginning of William's criminal career. Later records show that, despite being imprisoned in Texas for the murder of his daughter, William did not reform after his release. Instead, he continued to abuse his 3-month-old daughter with his second wife. August 17, 1995, the jury took only 10 minutes to return guilty verdicts on William's 12 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. October 26th of the same year, the trial court, following the jury's decision, ordered William to be sentenced to death. He was sent to the death row at San Quentin State Prison. However, this prison, which had once executed many death row inmates, no longer carried out death sentences, and later, in 2019, California officially abolished the death penalty. Also in 2019, a murder case that had been for over 30 years saw a breakthrough. On February 22, 1986, a murder occurred in South Pasadena, Los Angeles County. A woman dressed in pajamas was found lying in the middle of the street with multiple stab wounds on her body. Although the South Pasadena police rushed to the scene quickly, the woman had already stopped breathing and was declared dead on the spot. Since she had no identification on her, they could only temporarily list her as Jane Doe 17. In the days following the case, the police received a call. On the other end of the line, a man from the Lake Elsinore area anxiously inquired whether a woman named Kathy Small had been reported missing. He claimed that Small was his roommate and had disappeared several days ago. He then recounted Small's last known whereabouts to the police. According to his recollection, Small was a woman who had lived in the Lake Elsinore area for a few months. Several days prior, she had told him that a man named Bill had contacted her, offering her $50 to drive to Los Angeles with him, and that was the last time he saw Small, after which she vanished without a trace. Later, although the police followed up on numerous leads over the years, Small's murder remained unsolved. On October 11, 2019, the police received a call. The caller reported that a man had died of natural causes across the street from where Small's body was found. Upon arriving at the scene, the forensic experts found many disturbing items in the deceased's home, including a large number of photos of women who appeared to have been attacked and held against their will, as well as a newspaper article about the identification of Small after her murder. They confirmed that Small's death wasn't related to the other persons, but the police realized they had a problem. Forensic technology has gotten a lot better over the years, especially with the rise of DNA technology, but none of the evidence from Small's murder case, including evidence of sexual assault and Small's clothing, had been tested. In August 2020, the police ran DNA tests on these pieces of evidence, and in the end, they found DNA from 2 males. One was William, while the other one remained unknown. Upon questioning, William admitted to the crime of killing Small. He recalled that in 1986, he worked at a computer repair shop in Lake Elsinore. On the day of the incident, Small walked into his shop and gave him her phone number. That evening, he called Small, saying he would pick her up to go to Los Angeles. During the drive, an argument broke out between them, and in a fit of rage, he took out a knife and stabbed Small, who was sitting in the passenger seat, multiple times. When Small passed away, she left behind 2 young children and a 10-year-old sister. While learning the truth, Small's sister, who lived out of state, wrote a letter. She wrote, "My sister was not a statistic. She was a good sister, a good mother, and a good daughter. She was funny, intelligent, and loving. Although she was a sex worker and a drug user at the time, she was trying to change her behavior and stop using drugs. But just as she was about to take a step forward, her life was cut short." Most of William's victims were sex workers. So, why did he harbor such animosity toward women, especially sex workers, even murdering and abusing his own daughter? The answers lie in William's childhood experiences. He was born into an ordinary family in Torrance, California, and was the eldest of 5 children. Initially, there were no particularly notable events in his early years, and he even showed a talent for music as he grew up. However, it was in this seemingly ordinary family that the seeds of violence and hatred were sown. His mother was a very dominant woman who had a strong controlling influence over his father. Growing up, he witnessed how his mother used coercion and control to get what she wanted. It was this family environment that shaped his personality and behavior, teaching him to treat others in the same manner. For instance, William threatened to kill his wife just to force her to obey his commands. In 1960, when he was 10 years old, his parents separated amid mutual accusations of infidelity. Particularly after his mother separated from his father, her life became chaotic, and she even became a sex worker. That's why William harbored such intense loathing and hatred toward women and sex workers. In 1968, at the age of 18, William met Terrell, who was 15 years old, in a marching band. The two quickly fell deeply in love and got married in 1969. However, married life did not turn out as Terrell had imagined. William's domineering and abusive behavior gradually emerged. He frequently insulted and beat her and even threatened her with death. In November 1970, Terrell gave birth to a boy. In reality, although William's abuse of Terrell continued, his domineering and abusive behavior was directed only at women, not men. He never abused his son. While imprisoned on death row at San Quentin State Prison, William revealed several murders. Although he was not charged or tried for most of them, except for one victim named Sherry Pérez, the victims included Michelle Gutierrez, age 26, who died on October 29, 1986. Charlotte Palmer, age 25, who died on December 10, 1986. Linda Ortega, aged 37, who died on April 29, 1988. Martha Young, age 27, who died on May 2, 1988. Linda Ruiz, age 37, who died on January 17, 1989. Judy Angel, age 36, who died on November 11, 1989. Sherry Pérez, age 24, who died on April 27, 1991. William's childhood and family environment laid the groundwork for his later criminal behavior. It is said that 2 of William's brothers, one had drug problems and the other had pedophilic tendencies. But these painful experiences could never serve as a reason to exonerate William. His violence and need for control not only affected his family, but ultimately impacted the entire Riverside County. Society always thinks of police officers, prosecutors, judges, lawyers, and teachers as having high moral standards and idealized images. For instance, police officers are seen as embodiments of justice, and teachers are regarded as disseminators of knowledge and guides of morality. However, real life is far more complex than this idealized picture. It's important not to get too caught up in the prestige of any profession. In any field, there will always be people who fail to meet the standards and break the rules. Some police officers will take bribes while some teachers will mistreat their students. Norbert Hans Polke was a police officer who not only killed 3 innocent victims but also murdered his entire family. There are various speculations about his motives for the killings. Some people believe that it was his overwhelming debt that led him down this path. Others speculate that his daughter's brain tumor was the cause, and that being unable to afford her treatment plunged him into despair and agony. But whatever his motives may be, he must be held fully accountable for his crimes. On September 15, 1951, Norbert was born into an ordinary family in Stuttgart, West Germany. It is said that his parents had fled from East Germany to West Germany. This experience left the family rather unpopular in society, where they were labeled as indecent. In those days, prices in West Germany were soaring, food supplies were scarce, housing conditions were poor, and unemployment and homelessness were common. In order to ease the family's financial burden, children often took part-time jobs after school, such as delivering newspapers. Although Norbert's childhood life was not disclosed, his life was similar to this way. In 1968, after Norbert's parents divorced, he moved with his mother to Stromfelbach, Baden-Württemberg, where he tried to become a business apprentice but was eventually dismissed for his repeated unexplained absences. Time flew by, and soon it was 1971. At 20 years old, Norbert stood at a crossroads. After some contemplation, he decided to become a police officer. He threw himself into the job, and his dedication was quickly rewarded with a series of promotions. In his spare time, Norbert also found love. He married a gentle and kind-hearted wife and had 2 sons, leading an ordinary life. The police officer had a particular habit. Every time he passed by a lottery shop on his way home from work, he would buy a ticket. Having grown up in poverty, Norbert always harbored dreams of turning small bets into big wins. In the early 1980s, he won the lottery, a prize of 30,000 marks. Back then, the winnings were enough to buy an apartment near the city. Not long after, Norbert's wife also gave birth to a daughter. Then, the money and the arrival of his daughter sparked an idea in Norbert's mind. In reality, he had always harbored a dream of building a house of his own. The lottery winnings and his growing family fueled his desire to realize this dream. He eagerly began to plan the construction and prepared to move his family to the countryside. However, once the house was completed, Norbert had not only exhausted all the lottery money, but also used up the loan he had taken from the bank, leaving him with a debt of 300,000 marks. The huge debt loomed over him like a mountain, plunging him into an unprecedented predicament. Although in 1982 he was transferred to Mulhausen am Neckar's Canine Division as a high-ranking sergeant, his salary increased, but it was merely a drop in the bucket, far from enough to repay his debts. Later, in March 1984, another disaster struck the already heavily indebted family. His daughter, a 3-year-old girl, was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Faced with exorbitant medical expenses, Norbert was unable to pay. He could only watch helplessly as his daughter passed away in agony. And this event had a devastating impact on this family and became the turning point for Norbert's descent into crime. Firstly, Norbert's salary was entirely insufficient to cover his huge financial gap. He needed money, a large amount of money, to prevent his life from collapsing. However, legitimate means could not meet his urgent needs. Thus, he made a reckless decision to rob banks. As a police officer who had worked in the area for a decade, he was intimately familiar with everything there. He knew every street and corner and was thoroughly familiar with police procedures and investigation methods. But to carry out this plan, he had to be flawless, leaving no useful clues behind. He had a weapon and an escape route. So what he needed was a car. One car that did not belong to himself and anyone he knew. So, how to get a stranger's car? Theft? Norbert chose a method that was both simple and extreme. On May 3, 1984, he lingered near a highway rest stop in the Marbach area, waiting for the right person to carry out his plan. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, a car pulled into the gas station. The car's owner was a sales engineer named Siegfried. After stopping the car, he opened the door and stepped out to refuel. However, Norbert pulled out a gun from behind his back and, without warning, shot Siegfried in the face. He grabbed a hammer, shattered Siegfried's car window, climbed into the vehicle, started it, and drove away from the scene. Not long after, someone discovered Siegfried's body, with a gunshot wound to the face and found his car was gone. Around 12:25 that same morning, Norbert arrived at a bank in Erbstetten. There, he broke the counter window with a hammer and stole 5,000 marks. Although the bank staff managed to activate the alarm, Norbert had already fled in panic before the police arrived. In the days following the robbery, the bank employees endeavored to recall the perpetrator's physical characteristics. They described him as a man between 35 and 40 years old, with straight light brown hair, tall and slender, and dressed in a blue suit. Meanwhile, investigators collected bloodstains from the bank, which were left behind when Norbert injured his hand while smashing the counter window. After the robbery, the police discovered an abandoned car a few hundred meters from the scene of Siegfried's death, and not long after, it was identified as his car. However, certain key details aroused the suspicion of the police, leading them to suspect the bank robber was likely also Siegfried's murderer. The car had mysteriously disappeared before the robbery and then reappeared after the robbery. Moreover, both the bank counter window and the car window were shattered with a hammer. As time went on, the police established a special investigative committee comprising 20 top investigators to focus on the case. They also issued a public warning, urging everyone to be vigilant, as the murderer was likely to use a firearm ruthlessly. However, despite an extensive investigation, the police still failed to apprehend the murderer. 5,000 marks were a mere drop in the ocean compared to Norbert's debt of 300,000. Sensing that the police investigation had hit a dead end, he turned to crime once more. In December of the same year, Wevy, a 37-year-old British expatriate living in Nuremberg, was resting at the parking lot in Großbutt-War. He was preparing to travel to Switzerland to spend Christmas with his parents, but on the way, he was attacked and killed by a stranger. Obviously, the murderer was Norbert, who had initially intended only to steal Wevy's car. Compared to his first crime, he took more time to conceal the body, dragging Wevy's remains to a nearby grove and covering them with leaves. A week later, he used the stolen vehicle in a bank robbery in Klebron, from which he made off with 79,000 marks. Several days after the robbery, a passerby discovered Wevy's body. During the investigation, the police found a crucial clue, a cartridge case nearly identical to the one from Siegfried's murder. It is well known, each bullet is like a unique footprint left at the crime scene, imparting specific marks and grooves on its trajectory. The ballistics department, well aware of this, conducted an extensive analysis, examining over 12,000 weapon models in an attempt to find the key clue. In those days, the investigation mounted by the German police was unprecedented. They mobilized a significant number of officers to conduct a thorough investigation of 1,400 individuals, questioning them about possible involvement. Despite the extensive scope, no one fully matched the witness description of the murderer. But, fortunately, investigators got obtained several promising leads. The murderer killed to obtain a car for a quick getaway after the robbery. He used a hammer to break into vehicles and bank windows not to harm people, which indicated that his purpose was very clear. He just wanted money. In addition, the weapon used in all the killings was the same, a standard pistol widely used by the West German police and security personnel. Obviously, the murderer had connections within the police or security personnel. On July 22, 1985, Wilfried, a 27-year-old electrician, was found dead, his death identical to that of the previous victims. On the very same day, Norbert struck again, attempting to rob a bank. However, this time he was unsuccessful because the bank was surrounded by police. His plan was foiled, forcing him to flee in panic. Wilfried's death had the police on edge. As time went on, an unsettling rumor began to spread. The serial killer was likely a police officer. Amidst this tense atmosphere, the police even mistakenly arrested an Italian agent. In 1985, West Germany saw over 1,600 politically motivated bombings, arson attacks, murders, and other violent crimes. On September 29th, a bomb threat was reported at the Ludwigsburg railway station. While searching for bombs, the police found a police uniform in a locker, stained with blood. Later, the uniform was traced to Detective Chief Superintendent Norbert, a police officer of 14 years in Stuttgart. When questioned about why the uniform was left there, Norbert replied that he had attended a funeral. However, after investigating his whereabouts, they found that he had not attended any funeral recently. The only funeral he had attended was in 1984, his daughter's, who had died of a brain tumor. On October 14th, Norbert applied for sick leave. Several days later, the police arrived at his house, intending to question him about the murders and robberies. When they knocked on the door, there was no response. Fearing that Norbert might have fled, they forcibly entered. However, the sight inside shocked all the officers. Norbert's wife was lying in the bathroom, shot twice in the head, and his son, Adrian, was found dead in one of the bedrooms. On October 23rd, 3 days later, Norbert and his other son were found dead in a car at a village near Brindisi, Italy. Later, it was confirmed that Norbert's pistol was the murder weapon used in the killings, and the deaths of him and his family were ruled as suicide. With this, the case was finally closed. In the end, although Norbert's tragedy had come to an end, his name and his story remained in the places he had hurt. In 1985, several tweens were playing a game of hide-and-seek in the park. At the time, 11-year-old Jesse Morgan was one of them. He said that during the game, another tween found him and told him that he had found an abandoned metal drum in the woods. It was a deep blue 55-gallon metal drum with a slight rust. They called out to the other tweens and walked into the woods together. Then, in order to show off his bravery, the tween who found the metal drum walked up to it and pushed it over with force. Just in 1 second, a nauseating smell of decay wafted out. Like the other tweens, Morgan was also frightened by the smell, and they all scattered in a panic. 4 months later, 2 hunters on their way to hunt in the same park and found the abandoned metal drum. The metal drum was lying on its side on the ground, emitting an extremely complex and unbearable odor. This time, out of curiosity, one of the hunters approached and reached out to open the lid of the metal drum. However, a human foot bone fell out from inside. The park is Bear Brook State Park, located in Allenstown, New Hampshire. Bear Brook State Park is a vibrant natural paradise, home to many wild animals, including a variety of birds, moose, and coyotes. Realizing that this was a case of body dumping, the 2 hunters were horrified, and they immediately called the police. Inside the metal drum were 2 decomposed remains. One was an adult woman, and the other was a little girl. Even though they were wrapped in plastic and kept away from the air, their remains had already become skeletonized. The autopsy showed that both people died from a hard hit, and it looks like they died between 1978 and 1981. In the early stages of the investigation, the local police widely publicized the case across most regions in the United States and Canada. But even after getting hundreds of tips and putting in a lot of manpower and money, the police could not figure out who the real perpetrator was, or even the victims' real ages and identities. Later on, the 2 victims were buried in a cemetery in Allenstown. Their tombstones read, "Here are the remains of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl aged 8 to 10, whose identities are known only to God." As time went on, Bear Brook State Park slowly but surely went back to its usual calm atmosphere. However, in May 9th, 2000, about 15 years later, a second abandoned metal drum was found, containing the remains of 2 little girls. This second metal drum was only 100 yards away from the first one, and the cause of death for the 2 girls was also blunt force trauma. Clearly, all 4 victims were killed by the same perpetrator, and based on the degree of decomposition, the police were certain that all 4 murders occurred around the same time. However, since it's been so long since the crimes, the victims' remains are pretty much just bones, which makes the investigation really slow. Back to December 1999, when a man named Larry Vanner met a female chemist named Yoon-Soon Jun in California. In June 2002, Yoon-Soon Jun, who was in her 40s, disappeared without a trace. Nobody knew where she was, except for Larry, who was aware of her location. Consequently, the police brought Larry to the interrogation room for questioning and took his fingerprints. Several days later, police searched Yoon Soon Chun's residence in Richmond, California, including the entire house and a garage. At that time, a corner of the garage was piled high with cat litter. An investigator casually moved it around, and then a dismembered woman's foot appeared. Clearly, this was Yoon Soon Chun's dismembered foot. She had already been murdered. In November 2002, Larry was arrested by the police. In addition, the police had found something shocking. Larry's fingerprints matched those of a guy named Curtis Campbell. Back in 1985, he was arrested for drunk driving and endangering a little girl. And in 1986, he abandoned the little girl in a mobile home park in Scotts Valley, California, under the alias Gordon Jensen. Until his identity was uncovered, he had been wanted for child abandonment. In 2003, with 2 aliases, Campbell stood in court and openly admitted his crimes, and he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. His confession shocked everyone, especially a police officer named Grunheid. She believed that Campbell chose to plead guilty because he thought that by doing so, she would stop investigating his past. According to information provided by Grunheid and her team, Campbell's criminal record began in 1985. That year, he was arrested under the name Campbell after a car accident in Cypress, California. At the time, a girl named Lisa was with him. Later on, he was charged with drunk driving and endangering the welfare of a child. Since he failed to appear in court, a warrant was also issued for his arrest. In January 1986, he and Lisa lived in a mobile home park in Scotts Valley, California. There, he worked as a handyman under the name Gordon Jensen. Richard and Catherine, an elderly couple who also lived in the park, noticed that Gordon was not taking care of Lisa at all, so they took it upon themselves to look after her. Later on, the couple wanted their daughter to adopt Lisa and took her to Southern California. However, there Lisa revealed to them that she had been abused, so the elderly couple called the police. In June 1986, the man escaped from the mobile home park in the name of Gordon, and the police issued an arrest warrant for him. In March 1989, Campbell, alias Green Mockerman, was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison because his fingerprints linked him to Gordon. He was released on parole in October 1990. Later on, in 1999, he reappeared in California under the name Larry. In 2003, Lisa, in her 20s, approached the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, hoping to find her biological parents. Initially, everyone assumed that Campbell was her biological father, but DNA testing confirmed that Campbell was not her father, leaving the case at an impasse. In 2013, Peder Headley of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department was assigned to handle Lisa's case. At the end of 2014, Lisa expressed to Peder her desire to find her biological parents. Several months later, with the help of genealogist Barbara, Lisa located her grandfather, Armand, who lived in New Hampshire. As Armand recounted the story, the truth about Lisa's origins finally came to light. Lisa was born in 1981, and her mother was a woman named Denise. And in reality, her real name was Dawn, not Lisa. Armand recalled that after Denise left her husband, she was with a man named Bob Evans. Around Thanksgiving in 1981, Evans said he owed a lot of money, so they had to leave Manchester. By Christmas, Armand had planned to invite Denise and her family to celebrate the holiday, but they had already left. From that point on, the man never saw his daughter and granddaughter again. Later, the police showed him a photo of Campbell, and he immediately recognized him as Evans, who had taken his daughter away. So the police started looking into Evans. After talking with some people who knew about it, they found out that in the late 1970s, Evans had worked as an electrician and handyman at a campground store in Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire. At this point, the victims of the Bear Brook murders had not yet been identified. At first, the police thought Denise was the grown woman. However, the DNA testing revealed no connection between Lisa and her. So the police tried another test using Evans' DNA, which successfully matched one of the victims, a girl who was 2 or 4 years old. Later, in 2015, investigators used the DNA test to confirm that the grown woman was the mother of the other 2 girls. In the late 1970s, he lived in New Hampshire under the name Evans. Around 1984, he lived in California under the names Campbell, Gary, and Gordon. In 2002, he murdered Yoon Jun under the name Larry. Campbell, Larry, Gordon, Evans, and even Gary. Although the police believed that this man was a serial killer responsible for the Bear Brook murders and Denise's death, the most critical point was that no one knew which identity was his real one, nor did anyone understand his past. Finally, in 2017, Barbara, through genetic genealogy and genealogical websites, uncovered the true identity of the serial killer. His name is Terry Peder Rasmussen, born on December 23, 1943, in Denver, Colorado. The police also found Terry's daughter Diane, who works as a records clerk at a police department in Illinois. In the interview, she recalled that in the 1960s, her father served in the U.S. Navy, and in 1968, her parents got married in Hawaii and had 4 children. According to her mother, in 1975, Terry was arrested for a serious assault, after which she left him with their 4 children. Around 1976, Terry showed up at their house with an unidentified woman, and upon seeing this woman, her mother decided to divorce him. When Diane found out that Terry was a serial killer, she said, "If my mom hadn't left my dad, the one who might have died could have been me." Although the true identity of the serial killer had been uncovered, the identities of the 4 victims had yet to be confirmed. However, not long after, a woman named Heath provided an extremely important clue. She was a librarian and an internet detective who had a keen interest in the Bear Brook murders and had always hoped to uncover the true identities of the victims. In October 2018, she discovered an internet post from 1999. In the post, a man was trying to find his half-sister named Sarah, who was born in Hawaiian Gardens, California. In those days, her father was serving in the Marine Corps. However, on Thanksgiving Day in 1978, Sarah's mother, 24-year-old Marlies, had an argument with her own mother and then left home with her 2 daughters, 1-year-old Sarah and 6-year-old Marie, heading to New Hampshire. From that point on, they lost contact with their family. Later, Heath contacted a relative of Sarah, who mentioned that the likely reason Marlies left home was that she had married a man named Terry. Soon after, Heath found out that Terry had been living in New Hampshire under the name Bob Evans. But his wife was not Marlies, was a woman named Elizabeth Evans. Like Marlies, she was also accompanied by 2 children. In May 1980, Elizabeth appeared in a legal document. Later on, she and her children mysteriously vanished, and shortly thereafter, Terry left New Hampshire as well. Heath realized that these clues fit together logically. For instance, Elizabeth was likely an alias for Marlies, and their ages matched those of 3 of the Bear Brook murder victims, and their familial relationships had also been confirmed by the police. After uncovering this information, she shared her findings with Peder, the detective who had helped Lisa search for her biological parents. On June 6, 2019, investigators from New Hampshire held a press conference, confirming that the true identities of the 3 victims were Marlies, Marie, and Sarah, who had gone missing years ago, and that their killer was Terry. Several months later, the funerals for Marlies and Marie were held again in Allenstown, and their tombstones were inscribed with their names. Diane, Terry's daughter, was invited to the funeral. She said, "I don't know if I can make up for my father's sins. They told me, 'How do you make up for something like this?' It's not your fault," she added. "Because of my father, they lost their sister and niece. What ties us together is the terrible thing that happened here, but they treat me like they would treat their sister." Sarah was buried in Connecticut, closer to her father's family. And although we all knew the 4th victim was Terry's daughter, her identity remained unconfirmed until this year, when a team of genetic genealogists, through advanced DNA testing, genealogical analysis, and birth records, finally identified the 4th victim as a girl named Ree, born in 1976, whose mother was the long-missing Pepper Reed. This woman, Pepper, was last seen around Christmas in 1975. Before she had given birth to Ree, she left Texas secretly without informing her family. And based on timeline, her time of death is around the end of 1976 or 1977. Even though the truth came out, Terry had already died on December 28, 2010, in the High Desert State Prison. Over the years, he had been involved in murders, kidnappings, and deceptions across multiple states under various aliases. Looking at the many murders he committed, it's clear that he didn't target strangers. He just went after women and children who believed in and loved him. Connecticut is one of the top financial centers in the United States, and its per capita income is also at the forefront of the world. 5 years ago, the virus broke out in the world. Connecticut was no exception. Like other cities, it put a stay-at-home order in place. People were stuck at home and couldn't go out, and loads of businesses in catering and retail had to close. But actually, this was not the first time Connecticut had been through something like this. 68 years ago, the people there felt a kind of fear that felt like it was stopping them from breathing. In those days, people would lock their doors really tight and would not go outside, and after sunset, all kinds of shops would close doors. It was not because of a virus, it was because of two real men wandering the streets, Joseph Taborski and Arthur Cullum, who committed a series of brutal robberies and murders. In addition, there's so much drama in the story of Joseph and Arthur. Joseph is the only criminal in Connecticut's history who's been sentenced to death twice for different crimes. Arthur never knew he had the right to remain silent or the right to legal counsel, and his confession was made after being put through the ringer for days and the cops threatening him. Joseph was born in Hartford on the 23rd of March 1924. He was the eldest in his family, with a younger brother and 2 sisters. His mother was a proper religious woman, spent all her time running the house and keeping the family going. His father was a salesman who worked door to door, had a mental disability, and was often away from home. As the eldest son, Joseph didn't get the attention from his mother that he should have, and he also lacked the fatherly love and guidance he needed. When Joseph was 7 years old, he committed his first crime, stealing a bike, and in the following months, he continued to commit several counts of burglary and shoplifting. Later on, his mother remembered that Joseph had nicked a bike out of resentment after his own bike had been stolen. She was a housewife who had to look after several kids and a husband with mental disabilities. She didn't have much time to correct his psychology and behavior. So she thought that Joseph's bike theft was just a way of dealing with his emotional issues. However, several months later, Joseph pinched another bike, and at that time he got sent down to a juvenile detention center for 9 months. Not long after, Joseph was sentenced to an extra 3 to 5 years in prison for escaping. The prison walls didn't stop him wanting to be free, but they did lock him up for most of his youth. Every time he got out of prison, he tried to get back into a normal life, working as a laborer and a truck driver. But it didn't take long before he was back in the prison for theft. Back in 1948, Joseph, age 24, started working at a freight transportation facility, where he first met his partner in crime, Arthur. Arthur was the same age, but he was as clueless as a 9-year-old, couldn't read or tell time. And later, a police officer said that Arthur's learning disability meant he was very easily influenced. For instance, on August 21st, 1944, Arthur was involved in the burglary and robbery of 2 service stations in Hartford with 2 other criminals. And in the very next day, he was involved in another robbery. As a result, Joseph, who was ambitious and had bad intentions, saw Arthur, who was intellectually limited, as the easiest person to manipulate. On March 23, 1950, Joseph, age 26, was at a crossroads in his life, and he chose a path that would take him down a one-way street. That day, he and his brother Albert had planned to rob Louis's liquor store in West Hartford. Louis was just an ordinary businessman who worked hard every day to make a living, yet he became a victim of this terrible crime. During the robbery, Joseph and Albert accidentally shot Louis in the face. Louis was really badly hurt. Although he made it to hospital, he was close to dying. But he was still managed to give the police a description of the gunman. He said, light hair, baby face, medium height, as he was breathing his last. In reality, this description didn't match the physical characteristics of Joseph and Albert, especially Joseph, who was about 6 feet 4 inches tall, had black hair, and a prominent chin. Because of the wrong description of the suspect, the murder case was still unsolved for a whole year. It was not until Albert, unable to bear the torment at his conscience, voluntarily surrendered to the police and admitted that he and his brother killed Louis. After the jury talked it over for 9 hours, they decided Joseph should be sentenced to death for first-degree murder on June 7, 1951, and Albert was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. While he was waiting to be executed, Joseph showed that he was a good lying, always saying that he was innocent. Meanwhile, Albert's mental state completely collapsed, and he was transferred to the prison's mental health department and then to Norwich State Hospital. As the witness who sent Joseph to death row, Albert's mental breakdown brought the case back into the public spotlight. Then, Joseph and his defense attorneys seized this opportunity, bribing some newspapers to label the Louis murder case as the Cain and Abel case. They claimed that out of jealousy and anger, Albert wanted to kill Joseph, so he deliberately confessed to send Joseph to death row. Albert's mental health issues and public opinion put pressure on the local court, who then said that the evidence used to convict Joseph and sentence him to death and keep him in prison was not enough. Joseph was let out of prison on the 6th of October 1955. Before he was let out of death row, Joseph did an interview in prison saying, "How can such great injustice be done to the innocent? If you could only realize the feeling of helplessness I had, it hurts me especially to see my mother suffer." Less than a year after he got out of prison, Joseph moved from Hartford to Brooklyn, New York, and married a woman who had often written to him while he was on death row. But his marriage and work were a bit rocky, which left Joseph feeling a bit lost. September 1956, Joseph got back in touch with Arthur and decided to team up with him for crimes. They started out committing burglaries and shop robberies in Hartford and the Rocky Mountains of Connecticut, but gradually moved on to murders. In early December, they robbed a hotel, but luckily the staff got away without any harm. Several days later, they hit a liquor store in Hartford. Jack, the owner of this liquor store, was constantly being beaten by Joseph and Arthur with a handgun. 7 days later, the Rocky Mountains became the stage for their evil deeds. They robbed a local store of at least $100, and the store owner was also beaten with a handgun. 4 days later, on December 15, 1956, Nicola, a 67-year-old tailor, was working in his shop when Joseph and Arthur burst in and shot him in the face. Luckily, the bullet only went into his neck and didn't kill him. An hour after Nicola was almost murdered, Joseph and Arthur drove to a petrol station in New Britain. Their minds were set on two things: robbing the place and killing anyone who got in their way. The gas station owner was Edward, a hard-working 30-year-old veteran. At the time, Edward was working on a car. So while they were filling up the tank, Joseph said he had to use the toilet and told Edward that Arthur would pay for the petrol. But after paying, Arthur went up to Edward and pulled out a Russian-style revolver. He threatened Edward, saying, "Go into the boiler room, or I will kill you." In that tiny space, Arthur shot Edward and stole his wallet. Meanwhile, Joseph took the money from the cash register. At this unfortunate moment, Daniel, also 30 years old and with his infant daughter in the car, pulled up to the gas station and parked at the entrance. Joseph and Arthur had just finished robbing the place and were planning to wait for Daniel to leave, but he didn't. So they decided to take action. They slowly approached Daniel's car, with Arthur pretending to check the vehicle to distract Daniel. Then, out of the blue, Joseph got closer, pointed a gun at Daniel and said he had to get out of the car, hand over his wallet and go to the restroom at the gas station, and there, Joseph shot Daniel in the head without hesitation. After that, Joseph and Arthur quickly left the crime scene. They drove to Arthur's house, split the stolen money evenly, and threw the bloodied revolver in a nearby shallow pond. Several hours later, Joseph went back to his home in Brooklyn, New York, as if nothing had happened. The next day, Edward and Daniel were found. Daniel's daughter was found safe in the car, but she'd fallen asleep from being hungry and tired. Both victims had been in the United States Armed Forces. So the double murder sent shockwaves through the whole state of Connecticut. The governor offered a reward of $3,000 for info that would lead to the arrest and conviction of the murderers, and the mayor of New Britain added another $2,000. The state police also set up a special task force to handle the case, which became known as the Mad Dog Killings. Just 6 days later, on December 21st, 1956, the pair went after a grocery store in Coventry. The store was owned by 64-year-old Vinton and his wife, and at the time their granddaughter, 3-year-old Lori, was also in the store. What was meant to be a cozy family moment was ruined by Joseph and Arthur barging in. They beat Vinton and his wife with a gun and stole $100. During the ordeal, Joseph told Arthur to kill Lori, but he didn't. Instead, he took her to a corner of the grocery store, told her to stay quiet, and fired a few shots into the floor to make it look like she was dead, to trick Joseph. 5 days later, on the evening of December 26th, a liquor store became their target. The 65-year-old owner, Cohn, was busy in the store when Joseph and Arthur burst in and shot him in the head. They then emptied the cash register, searched Cohn's pockets, and took all his money. Several minutes later, a customer went into Cohn's liquor store and found his body lying behind the counter. There were no witnesses and the neighbors didn't see or hear anything strange, but the police, who were pretty good at their jobs, figured out straight away that Cohn's murder was linked to the killings of Edward and Daniel on December 15th. The method was always the same. They'd empty the cash registers and wallets of their victims, then shoot them in the head before getting away and leaving no evidence. January 5th, 1957, Joseph and Arthur went on another crime spree, this time targeting a shoe store in North Haven, Connecticut. The owner was Frank, a 44-year-old businessman. At the time, the two crooks burst into the shoe store and forced Frank into a back room, where Arthur grabbed a gun and smashed it violently against Frank's head until he fell into a state of apparent death. But Joseph and Arthur's crimes weren't over yet, as there were still two customers in the store, 48-year-old Bernard and his wife Ruth. Since the couple had witnessed the entire assault on Frank, Bernard and Ruth would become key witnesses that could send Joseph and Arthur to prison if they were not silenced. So, Joseph and Arthur decided to eliminate them. They robbed the couple of their wallets, forced them to kneel on the ground, and shot them in the back of the head with a handgun, ending their lives. After the murder of Bernard and Ruth, the Connecticut police set up a special headquarters in North Haven dedicated to investigating the case. Liquor store operators also began arming themselves and bringing dogs to work in an attempt to fend off the attackers. What's more, Frank, who had been knocked into a state of apparent death, did not die. He was a lucky man. He survived. Frank gave the police a good description of the attacker's appearance when he was in the hospital ward. He remembered that one of the attackers had asked to see shoes in a size 12. And later, while reviewing prison records, police noticed that Joseph wore shoes of the same size. They then showed Frank some photos of Joseph and Arthur, and in the end, Frank was pretty sure that Arthur was one of the attackers. Around 9 o'clock on the evening of January 26th, Joseph and Arthur struck again, this time targeting Rosenthal's drugstore. At the time, 69-year-old John was alone on the first floor of the drugstore, while his son, Henry, was working in the basement. However, Joseph burst into the drugstore and fired 2 shots into John's chest, ending his life. Hearing the gunshots, Henry ran out from the basement and saw Joseph standing next to the cash register, looting the money. In a state of anger and fear, he threw a medicine bottle at Joseph, who fired back at Henry. Fortunately, the bullet only hit the wall. Joseph then fled outside, jumped into a dark-colored Studebaker, and left the scene. Later, Henry gave the officers a description of the attacker. He said the man was tall, between 30 and 40 years old, had black hair, and was wearing a coat. His description matched the clues Frank had given. In the end, police confirmed that Joseph and Arthur were behind the series of crimes. On February 23, 1957, they arrested Joseph and Arthur, charging them with disorderly conduct while awaiting the results of a full investigation into the murder spree. In order to prevent the two from colluding, police deliberately kept them in separate custody. Joseph was detained in the Hartford County Jail, while Arthur was held in the Hartford Police Barracks. 4 days later, after a lot of questioning and some force, Arthur admitted to being involved in 8 robberies and 6 murders, and showed the officers the weapon they'd used to kill Edward and Daniel. When Arthur first came clean, he said that Joseph had fired all the fatal shots, while he himself had only been involved in beating several victims with a handgun and driving their getaway car. Joseph initially insisted he wasn't involved in the crimes, but on March 1st, the police used a clever strategy. They encouraged Joseph's mother to bring a tape recorder and have a chat with Joseph to try and get him to confess. In the end, after his mother had a good nudge, Joseph came clean about all the murders, including the 1950 killing of Louis. Later on, even more shocking was that Joseph and Arthur committed a series of robberies and murders. But according to the police, despite killing several people and committing crimes that impacted the entire state of Connecticut, the loot they obtained amounted to less than $400. In May 1957, Joseph and Arthur stood trial together. The trial focused mostly on the murders of Edward and Daniel. Arthur's attorney tried to use Arthur's mental disability to persuade the jury not to impose the death penalty. He made a heartfelt plea in court saying, "I can't believe that any American jury would sentence Arthur, who has intellectual disabilities, to death." Joseph's attorney said that Joseph had spent 4 years on death row, so his murder spree was partly an act of revenge. He also mentioned something Joseph told the prison psychiatrist. "When I kill someone, they don't think it's wrong that they wanted to kill me." But during the trial, Joseph not only laughed at the evidence against him, he also made threatening gestures at others in the courtroom. This made the jury and spectators even angrier, and it also put his attorneys in a bit of a pickle. After weeks of heated deliberation and presentation of evidence, the jury finally ruled on June 27th that Joseph and Arthur were guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced them to death. The local newspaper also published an editorial in support of the death penalty for the two defendants, stating, "If the death penalty is justified, then it is justified for these two." While waiting to be executed, Joseph attempted suicide twice, but failed both times. Later, he wrote a letter stating that executing a criminal would be kinder than imprisoning them for years. He said he would rather die than spend the rest of his life in prison, and he acted on this by giving up all chances to appeal. On the evening of May 17, 1960, Joseph was executed by electric chair, marking the last time the electric chair was used in Connecticut. Meanwhile, Arthur continued fighting his death sentence. In the end, he accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder, sparing him the death penalty and sentencing him to life in prison. He died in prison on December 22, 1970, of natural causes. In reality, before the Mad Dog killings, the Connecticut governor and local newspapers had been calling for the abolition of the death penalty. But after the killings, the governor's stance shifted drastically. He stated he now supported the death penalty for Joseph and Arthur. Local newspapers also reversed their position, arguing that while the death penalty is neither a deterrent nor a perfect punishment, it is necessary in some cases, much like putting out a fire or putting down a mad dog. When Louis was murdered, his wife moved her family out of Connecticut. When Joseph was arrested, she repeatedly criticized those calling for the abolition of the death penalty, asking, "How does it feel knowing that you and others like you helped a man commit more murders when you could have stopped him after the first one?" In the 20th century, when hippie culture was popular in Europe and the United States, there was a travel line called the Hippie Trail. In those days, drawn to the religions and philosophies of the East, hippies followed this line across the Eurasian continent, starting from Western Europe, passing through Istanbul, crossing the Middle East, and finally arriving in, India and Nepal. However, the hippie trail also caught the attention of a serial killer, Charles Sobhraj, known as the Serpent. He and his criminal accomplices used hitchhiking, drugs, and lies as bait to commit a series of brutal and heinous robbery and murder cases there. April 6, 1944, Charles was born in Saigon, Indochina Union, which was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in 1976 and is located in Vietnam. His father was a Sindhi from India, and his mother was a Vietnamese woman with French citizenship. Charles' childhood was full of ups and downs. His parents were never married, and his father ruthlessly denied any paternal relationship with him. But fate did not completely abandon Charles. Later, Charles' mother married a Frenchman, a French army lieutenant stationed in the Indian colony. Initially, both his mother and stepfather were extremely caring towards him, taking him along whether they were in Southeast Asia or back in France. It was during these years that Charles grew up in a stable environment. In 1959, when he was 15 years old, with the help of his stepfather, his name was officially changed to Charles. But it's common knowledge that stepchildren can have a big impact on the birth of new life within a family. Charles was clearly the surplus one, and his emotional needs gradually began to be ignored by his mother and stepfather. During this time, he got into some small-time trouble. In 1963, he was first sent to prison for burglary and served his time in the Poissy prison near Pérez. In those dark days, Charles received special favors from the prison officials who allowed him to read books in his cell. It was also during this time that Charles met Felix, a young man from a wealthy family. Felix was one of the prison volunteers at the time. Every week, he would come to the prison to help the inmates write letters, resolve simple legal issues, and provide companionship. Charles, with his charm and lies, quickly became good friends with Felix, who even wanted to help him reconcile with his parents, though with limited success. After being paroled, Charles moved in with Felix. There, Charles began to navigate between the high society and the underworld of Paris, amassing his wealth through a series of burglaries and frauds. Meanwhile, he met Chantal, a young Parisian girl from a conservative family. Shortly after they met, they confirmed their romantic relationship. However, on the very day Charles proposed to Chantal, he was arrested while trying to evade the police while driving a stolen vehicle and was sentenced to 8 months in prison. Although Charles' imprisonment, Chantal never left him. She waited for him while he was serving his sentence. Therefore, as soon as Charles was released, he immediately married Chantal. In 1970, with Felix's help and due to his birth in a French colony, Charles obtained French citizenship. That same year, he left France quietly with Chantal, who was pregnant, heading to India because the French police were investigating his crimes. At that time, they traveled through Eastern Europe with fake documents and even robbed tourists they met along the way. After arriving in Mumbai, India, Charles, in order to satisfy his increasingly severe gambling addiction, continued his criminal career, engaging in car theft, smuggling, and robbery. It was during this time that he met Marie, a young backpacker from Canada. Influenced by Charles' sweet talk and carefully crafted facade, she became his most loyal follower. Meanwhile, Ajay, a young Indian man and a criminal, also became his accomplice. Notably, both Marie and Ajay would later become Charles' accomplices in murders. In 1971, Charles carried out a jewelry robbery at the Ashok Hotel in Delhi, India, which also attracted the attention of the police. Coincidentally, a criminal who had received help from the police joined Charles' criminal gang. Having seen that Charles and his associates were carrying firearms, he fearfully approached the police officer who had helped him, named Zende, and revealed Charles' plan to carry out a robbery near the Taj Hotel in Mumbai. Based on the information provided by this criminal, Zende set up a stackout near the Taj Hotel in Mumbai. Ultimately, Zende and his team successfully arrested Charles and his 5 criminal accomplices, confiscating the rifle and revolver used for the robbery. Charles was an extremely cunning individual. During his imprisonment, he feigned appendicitis and was admitted to the hospital. Later, he took advantage of the power outages caused by the India-Pakistan War to stealthily escape from the hospital's drainpipe, right under the noses of the guards. He was soon recaptured by the police. With no other choice, Charles borrowed money from his stepfather to pay the bail. Several days later, he fled to Kabul, Afghanistan with Chantal. In there, Charles and Chantal robbed Western tourists along the hippie trail. Not long after, he was arrested by the Afghan police for offenses such as car theft, illegal border crossing, and refusal to pay hotel bills. Once again, he resorted to his old tricks, faking illness and drugging the guards at the hospital to successfully escape from prison. However, this time, seeing her husband's actions, although Chantal still loved him, she had grown tired of the life of constant criminality and flight, so she took their daughter back to France and said never to see Charles again. Over the next 2 years, Charles was constantly on the run from the police. Knowing the weaknesses of human nature, sometimes he would disguise himself as a gemstone salesman, and at other times he would pose as a drug dealer, using carefully woven lies to deceive Western tourists, befriend them, and extract money from them as well as steal their passports. After arriving in Istanbul, Charles met his half-brother, Andre. Soon they became criminal accomplices and committed a series of crimes in Turkey and Greece. Eventually they were arrested in Athens, Greece. Charles managed to escape, but Andre was handed over to the Turkish police and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In 1975, Charles fled to Thailand. It was here that he and Ajay committed their first known murder. Later on, the police said that most of the people killed by Charles were actually part of his gang and had committed crimes. Charles said that most of his murders were accidental, due to overdoses of temazepam and heroin. To counter Charles' argument, the police insisted that the real reason for the murders was that the victims had threatened to expose Charles' criminal activities. Those days were the heyday of the hippie trail. A large number of backpackers and hippies traveled along the hippie trail to India, Nepal, and Thailand. It is well known the cultures and languages of Europe and Asia are completely different. For Western backpackers and hippies, arriving in Asia was like entering a completely different world, where tension and anxiety were extremely common. Charles took advantage of this. Speaking the same language, he fabricated false names and identities for himself, offering these tourists language assistance and places to stay, thereby gaining their trust. Charles' first victim was a young woman named Teresa Knowlton. She was from Seattle, United States. When her body was found, she was lying in a pool on the Gulf of Thailand, wearing a floral bikini. Initially, it was thought to be a swimming accident. However, an autopsy and forensic evidence several months later proved that her drowning was actually a murder. Next, a young Sephardic Jew named Vitaly Hakim became Charles' next victim. His body was found on the way to the resort in Pattaya, which was where Charles and his criminal gang were hiding. Later, a 29-year-old Dutch student, Henk Bintanja, and his 25-year-old fiancée, Cornelia Hemker, met Charles in Hong Kong and were invited by him to Thailand. Like the other victims, they were poisoned by Charles, affecting their health. Naturally, Charles used the excuse of taking care of their recovery to keep them in Thailand. As Henk and Cornelia gradually recovered, Vitaly's French girlfriend, Charmaine Carew, came to visit Charles, intending to find the missing Vitaly. Charles knew that if she discovered the truth, his crimes would be exposed. So he and Ajay quickly drove Henk and Cornelia out. Shortly after they were found, they had been strangled and burned. Charmaine was also found drowned, wearing a swimsuit style identical to Teresa's. At that time, investigators did not connect Teresa's and Charmaine's deaths. Later, when these cases were linked to Charles, he earned the nickname Bikini Killer. December 18, 1975, the very day that Henk and Cornelia were found, Charles and Marie brazenly used the couple's passports to enter Nepal. A few days later, on December 21st to 22nd, in Nepal, Charles brutally murdered 26-year-old Canadian Laurent and 29-year-old American Connie. Later, Charles and Marie used Laurent and Connie's passports to return to Thailand. However, upon returning to Thailand, Charles unexpectedly learned that 3 French tourists he had deceived had discovered the victim's identity documents and suspected him of multiple murders, reporting the case to the police and fleeing back to Pérez. Charles' next destination was reportedly Varanasi or Kolkata. There, he committed another murder in order to obtain the passport of Israeli scholar Avoni Jacob. And then, with Marie and Ajay, he traveled using the victims' passports, first to Singapore and back to India. In March 1976, despite knowing that the Thai police were investigating him, Charles returned to Bangkok once again. This time, he and Marie, along with Ajay, were interrogated by the police in connection with the murders, but were released. Meanwhile, Dutch diplomat Herman Nippenberg and his wife Angela Kane were working hard to investigate the murders of Henk and Cornelia. Herman had some knowledge of Charles and may have even seen him, though he was unaware of Charles' true identity. Later, with the help of Charles' neighbors Nadine and Remy Girard, he filed a lawsuit against Charles. However, it was only a month after Charles had left Thailand that Herman obtained police permission to search Charles' apartment, where he found concrete evidence of Charles' crimes, including the victims' documents and passports, as well as poison and syringes. Charles and Marie, along with Ajay, next headed to Malaysia. There, Ajay was seen handing over gems to Charles, which was the last time he was spotted. It is said that before Charles left Malaysia, He killed Ajay to eliminate any potential threats and continued to pose as a gem dealer with Marie. Later, there were claims that Ajay was seen in West Germany, but this assertion was never verified. In May 1976, Interpol issued an international arrest warrant for Charles, charging him with 4 murders in Thailand. However, Charles did not halt his activities. Instead, he formed a new criminal gang. The new members were 2 Western women living in Mumbai, Barbara Smith and Mary Either. His next victim was a Frenchman named Solomon, who was poisoned by Charles during a robbery. Charles had initially intended only to incapacitate Solomon and take his passport, but he accidentally killed him. In July 1976, in New Delhi, he and his 3 female accomplices deceived a group of French graduate students, convincing them to accept them as guides. During this time, Charles drugged the students, claiming the substances were anti-dysentery medication. However, the drugs took effect faster than Charles had anticipated. Before reaching their destination, some of the students began to lose consciousness. 3 of the students realized what Charles had done, quickly subdued him, and contacted the police. Later, Charles' accomplices Barbara and Either confessed during the interrogation. Charles was charged with the murder of Solomon, and all 4 were sent to Tihar Jail in New Delhi. While in Tihar Jail in New Delhi, Barbara and Either experienced extreme despair in the 2 years leading up to their trial, both attempting to end their lives in prison. However, Charles seemed to be in a completely different world. He entered the prison with valuable gems and used his extensive experience in bribery and kidnapping. He lived an extremely comfortable life in prison, with access to a television and gourmet food, and befriended both the guards and other inmates. Additionally, he turned the trial into a spectacle, casually hiring and firing lawyers, and even enlisted the help of his paroled brother Andre. Ultimately, Charles was sentenced to only 12 years in prison after staging a hunger strike. Meanwhile, Marie was convicted of drugging the French students. Later, due to her ovarian cancer, she was deported back to Canada. According to reports, even before her death, Marie still tried to defend Charles. In his imprisonment, Charles also gave interviews to Western writers and journalists, freely discussing his murders with them. However, later on, he denied his previous statements, pretending that his actions were a form of revenge against Western imperialism in Asia. In March 1986, during the 10th year of his imprisonment and just before his sentence was about to end, Charles realized that he was about to be extradited to Thailand for trial and would likely face the death penalty. So, he threw a grand party for his guards and fellow inmates, drugged them with sleeping pills during the event, and took the opportunity to walk out of the prison. In order to capture Charles, the Indian police turned to Zende, who had arrested him over a decade earlier. Receiving the order, Zende assembled a team and began tracking Charles' whereabouts. Their investigation went extremely smoothly, quickly yielding 2 key leads. The first was from a hotel owner in Mumbai who noticed that a man's license plate did not match the official records. The second was from a telephone exchange in Goa, which showed that a man frequently visited a restaurant and made international calls. Zende, posing as a tourist, spent several days observing the restaurant. On the evening of April 6, 1986, Zende saw Charles, wearing a hat, enter the restaurant gracefully. And then, he and his team approached Charles and said, "Hello, Charles. How are you?" Hearing this, Charles attempted to draw his weapon but was swiftly arrested by Zende's team. Later, due to his prison escape, Charles was sentenced to an additional 10 years in prison. However, this was precisely what Charles had anticipated. On February 17, 1997, at the age of 52, Charles walked out of prison. By this time, most of his arrest warrants and evidence had become invalid, and even the witnesses had long since disappeared. Since no country could extradite Charles, the Indian police could only watch as he returned to France. Living in the suburbs of Pérez, Charles led an extremely comfortable life. He earned substantial fees from interviews and photo shoots, and even the rights to a movie based on his life were sold for over $15 million. However, Charles seemed to have been intoxicated by the attention he received. In 2003, he made an inexplicable decision to return to Nepal, one of the few countries where he could be arrested. On September 1, 2003, A reporter from the Himalayan Times chanced upon Charles in a casino in Kathmandu. In order to gain attention, the reporter followed Charles for 2 weeks and wrote a news article with photographs. After seeing the report, the Nepalese police quickly took action, raided the casino, and arrested Charles while he was gambling. In 2004, Charles was sentenced to life imprisonment for the 1975 murder of Connie. On September 18, 2014, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the 1975 murder of Laurent. On December 23, 2022, the Supreme Court of Nepal ordered Charles' release from prison on humanitarian grounds due to his advanced age and deteriorating health. This day, at the age of 81, Charles still lives in France, though his condition is frail. No one knows exactly how many people Charles killed. He has made various confessions and admitted to 12 murders. However, given his frequent lies and tendency to retract his statements, it is clear that 12 is likely not the true number. Although the exact number of his victims and his motives for killing remain uncertain, one thing is certain: Charles shows no remorse for his crimes. In the city of Troy, New York, there's a chilling story that still circulates through the streets and alleys. Gary Charles Evans, a man who transformed from a notorious thief into an infamous serial killer. His life was filled with theft, crime, and tragedy. In those days, he led a gang specializing in stealing antiques, and they even stole a 1,000-pound marble tombstone. He committed 5 murders, and 3 of them were his own accomplices. In the prison interview, Evans displayed a complex personality. He could kill and dismember his victims without hesitation. However, when the officer mentioned the child of one of the victims, he struggled to hold back his emotions. His eyes welled up with tears, and his voice trembled as he said, "I'm a heartless criminal. This is your only blackmail to me. You have to protect the children at all costs." So why did he display such a complex personality? Let's go back to the early years of this criminal. Abuse and verbal abuse are the shackles some parents use to bind their children. Though adulthood may bring physical escape, the distorted values implanted in childhood go on to define a lifetime. On October 7, 1954, in Troy, New York, Flora gave birth to her first child, Evans. In the following years, she had another girl, Robbie. However, the family's happiness did not last long. After the 2 pregnancies and frequent beatings from her husband, Flora gradually fell into depression. She spent her days crying and in a state of anxiety, unable to take care of Evans and Robbie. Their father, Leroy, a man with a volotyper who was extremely fond of using violence to solve problems, was equally incapable of taking care of the children. In their childhood, Evans and Robbie grew up in a family environment filled with violence and instability. Their father's irritable temper was like a time bomb that could explode at any moment. He not only beat the children, but also did not spare Flora, who was suffering from depression. In those dark days, Evans and Robbie also witnessed their mother's multiple unsuccessful suicide attempts. According to Robbie's recollection, at the age of 7, Evans once grabbed a butcher knife and attempted to stab his father, who was beating his mother. Evans later recalled that he was sexually abused by his father at the age of 8. In such dire straits, Evans revealed a yearning for beauty, possessing an innate sensitivity toward artworks and precious objects. Also, at the age of 8, Evans first experienced the thrill of stealing. He stole a piece of jewelry worth $1,000. Although he was caught soon after, the experience did not frighten him. Instead, it revealed to him a new sense of freedom. At school, he began to frequently steal books, comics, and other small items, and occasionally he would risk shoplifting. Even though these actions made him a notorious thief, he didn't care at all. In 1968, Evans' life underwent a change. In order to cure her depression and escape her violent husband, Flora chose to divorce. She moved to Cohoes with Evans and started a new life. In the summer of 1970, Evans was arrested for breaking into someone's room and was sent to a juvenile detention center, where he had to stay for 3 months. While Evans was in detention, Flora's life also fell into chaos. She began to drink heavily, trying to numb her pain with alcohol. In just a few months, Flora even married and quickly divorced 4 men. After Evans was released, he was further shocked and confused to learn that his mother had publicly come out as a lesbian. Then, the relationship between Evans and his mother was extremely strained. They constantly argued over trivial matters. In the end, the frequent quarrels suffocated Evans, and he made the difficult decision to run away from home, drop out of school, and end up on the streets. Later, in the prison interview, Evans said that his nights spent in abandoned buildings and junkyards were extremely tough. In the winter, without warm clothes, he suffered greatly, but it was still better than the family life he had fled. When talking about his parents, Evans said painfully and disappointedly that they were not good people and were incompetent parents. In the mid-1970s, Evans returned to Troy, a city that was both familiar and strange to him. There, he reconnected with his childhood friends, Michael Falco and Timothy Reisdorf. The three of them rented an apartment together, and Evans also found a job. On January 13, 1977, Evans was arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison for trespassing and theft of property in Lake Placid. He was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora to serve his sentence. Within the high walls of the prison, time seemed to drag on endlessly, and Evans gradually developed an interest in fitness. During his incarceration, his father, Leroy, passed away from throat cancer. On March 21, 1980, Evans was granted parole and returned to the shared apartment in Troy. In order to make money, he and Michael, along with Timothy, began a series of robberies and thefts. They also turned their shared apartment into a hideout for selling stolen goods. In June of the same year, Evans was arrested again for theft and was detained in the old Rensselaer County Jail. After entering a prison, Evans deliberately provoked several Hells Angels members, saying things like, "I bet you can't throw me over that fence." However, they actually threw him over it, and eventually, Evans climbed the barbed wire fence and escaped from prison. The Hells Angels is an international outlaw motorcycle club founded in California and is considered an organized crime group. But Evans' freedom did not last long. Just 5 hours later, he was recaptured and sent back to Clinton Correctional Facility. In 1982, after a fierce brawl among inmates at Clinton Correctional Facility, Evans was transferred to Attica Correctional Facility, where he remained until his release on December 29th. Just a month later, he and Michael committed several petty thefts and moved to Florida. On February 5th of the same year, Evans's mother, Flora, died after falling and hitting her head on a car bumper. This accident forced Evans to return to New York State with Michael to attend his mother's funeral. In addition, they got in touch with Timothy and resumed their criminal activities. 2 months later, Evans was arrested in Saratoga County for burglary and unlawful entry. For the remainder of that year, he was transferred between various prisons multiple times, but was never brought to trial, and eventually, he was released from prison in March 1984. Meanwhile, Timothy ceased all contact with Evans and Michael. No one knows why Timothy did this, but about 3 years later, during the same period, his wife gave birth to a boy. Despite Timothy's departure, the theft gang of Evans and Michael did not disband. With Michael's assistance, Evans continued his criminal career. On February 16, 1985, they robbed an antique collector's apartment and made a profit of about $15,000. Just 2 months later, Evans stole a car and sold it for $12,000. However, the car belonged to 2 drug dealers who caught Evans, severely beat him, and handed him over to the police in Cohoes. Later, Evans accepted a plea deal with the prosecutor in exchange for a reduced sentence, admitting to charges of robbery and illegal possession of a weapon. Evans then promised to stop stealing and find a good job before he was granted probation. However, fate seemed to have laid out another path for Evans. In July of that year, he would commit his first murder. In those days, he didn't understand what murder meant. But in the prison interview, he choked up and said, "I would rather be a thief forever. This is not what I wanted." When asked what turned him from a thief into a murderer, he replied bluntly, "I think it was mainly the long years in prison." In the last few days of July 1985, Evans built an improvised silencer for his pistol and used it to kill his accomplice, Michael. He then dismembered the body with a chainsaw and called Timothy, asking for his help in disposing of the body. Although Timothy was extremely hesitant, he still agreed. They stuffed Michael's body into a sleeping bag and drove to the Lake Worth corridor, Florida, where Evans's sister, Robbie, lived. And there, they buried the body in a swamp near Robbie's house. In the prison interview, he revealed that he didn't kill his accomplice to keep the loot for himself, and it certainly wasn't out of greed. Another account suggests that his motive for killing Michael was revenge, because Timothy told him that Michael had been selling the stolen goods to Timothy and keeping the profits for himself, without sharing any with him. After staying in Lake Worth corridor for about 6 weeks, Evans and Timothy returned to New York. Later, Evans was arrested again for parole violation and sentenced to 4 years in prison. There, he met his close friend, the notorious serial killer, David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam. The two became friends due to their shared interest in bodybuilding. Even after Evans was released from prison, they often corresponded, sharing their lives and thoughts with each other. However, life in prison was not peaceful. In December 1987, Evans had a fight with an inmate who had sexually abused children, for which he was placed in solitary confinement for several months. But for Evans, he could not tolerate anyone harming children. This anger stemmed from his own miserable childhood. He had a strong weightlifter-like physique. He did not eat meat, poultry, or fish, and he did not smoke, drink alcohol, or use drugs. He was a person with almost no weaknesses, except for one: children. Because he had suffered pain himself, he could not turn a blind eye to those who harmed children. On March 1st, 1988, Evans was released from prison again. Soon after, he met a 27-year-old thief named Damian Cuomo and began to commit crimes with him. From March 1988 to September 1989, they carried out a series of successful thefts and robberies, becoming increasingly skilled in their criminal activities. During this period, they were also arrested, and the police found ski masks, stun guns, radio scanners, and ropes in the trunk of their car. However, due to insufficient evidence, both men were released. On September 8, 1989, Evans shot and killed 63-year-old thrift store owner Douglas Berry while robbing a store in Watertown. Then he and Damian stole items worth $15,000. By December 29th, Damian showed signs of depression. Since Evans's mother had also suffered from severe depression, he feared Damian might inform the police. Thus, he shot and killed him. In the early 1990s, Evans moved back to Florida, where he stayed for a few weeks before relocating to California. There, he encountered a woman he had known for 15 years. However, shortly after, he was arrested for threatening the woman and her husband because she refused to have sex with him. Facing potential criminal liability, he accepted a proposal to leave California in exchange for them not pressing any charges against him. Back in New York, on October 17, 1991, Evans murdered 36-year-old secondhand thrift shop owner Gregory Yelvin. He stole several items and sold them for a total of $60,000. Later, he discarded the murder weapon and buried it in the Albany Rural Cemetery in Menons. While there, he removed a 1,000-pound marble tombstone and successfully sold it. After killing Gregory, Evans decided to retire from his criminal career. In the following years, he worked as a temporary laborer, but occasionally, he still indulged in petty theft. For instance, in 1993, he stole cufflinks worth $1,500 from a group shop in Quechee. Later, he broke into the Norman Williams Library in Woodstock, Vermont, and stole a valuable book titled The Birds of America, and the original hand-painted edition of which was worth millions of dollars. In January 1994, the dealer who had purchased the marble tombstone chose to call the police and implicated Evans, and he was arrested for theft and vandalism and was ordered to serve a 1-month sentence in Albany County Jail. After his release, he moved to Vermont, where he adopted a survivalist lifestyle, living in a tent and trying to distance himself from his crimes. However, justice may be delayed, but it never fails. In June 1994, the police found Evans again because he had stolen the Birds of America. Faced with the threat of a life sentence, Evans revealed the location of the book and returned it in perfect condition. He was sentenced to only 24 months at an undisclosed prison in Vermont. On June 6, 1996, he was paroled and returned to New York. There, he rekindled his partnership with Timothy, and the two rented a storage unit in Colony to store tools and stolen goods. As time went on, Evans became increasingly paranoid, suspecting that Timothy would betray him to the police. On October 3, 1997, driven by fear and suspicion, he shot and killed Timothy. He dismembered it, buried the remains in the woods, and carefully handled the murder weapon. In reality, his paranoia stemmed from the fact that since the mid-1980s, the police had been constantly tracking him. He suspected that they had bugged his car, and to confirm his suspicions, he even spent 5 hours on a rainy rooftop wearing night vision goggles. Later, Evans stated that Horton, the officer who had been tracking him for years, had pursued him like a hound for many years, tirelessly gathering any evidence that could lead to a conviction, no matter how trivial. To evade Horton's pursuit, Evans lived on edge, moving to 3 or 4 different apartments each year, and frequently residing in motels. On May 27, 1998, a woman, the former lover of one of the men Evans had murdered, identified his hiding place to the police. At that time, Evans was in the downtown area of St. Johnsbury, Vermont. Horton and the officers jumped out of their cars, drew their guns, and surrounded him, and finally, a police dog successfully captured Evans as he tried to flee. Despite being arrested, Evans initially faced only charges of violating his probation and theft. The murders he had committed had not yet been discovered by the police. During an interview, he appeared unusually calm, stating that he had no worries wherever he went because he had long accepted his bleak future. Several days later, in a new round of interviews, Evans made an unexpected decision. Against his lawyer's advice, he confessed to killing 5 men. At that time, Horton informed him that a little boy was wondering about the whereabouts of his father, unsure if he had been abandoned. That boy was Timothy's 9-year-old son. Hearing this news, Evans struggled to hold back his emotions. His eyes welled up with tears, and he said, "I'm a heartless criminal. Yet, he made me feel sympathy for that innocent child who needs to know the truth. This is the only leverage he has over me. You have to protect the child at all costs." When the police emphasized that the 2 murdered shopkeepers had not been involved in any criminal activities, he retorted that these people were not innocent. They had knowingly purchased stolen goods from him. When asked if he regretted killing his victims, Evans candidly said, "Those people were all criminals. They were my accomplices. So I felt no pity. These words may sound cold, but they are the truth." He then added, "I feel more sorry for the children. I never intended to do that. I would rather be a thief forever. This is not what I wanted." On June 24th, Evans sat in the interrogation room, facing the police's questions. He described each of the killings in detail and revealed the burial locations of Michael and Timothy. His descriptions were so precise that the police were able to find their remains very smoothly at the specified locations. On August 12, 1998, Evans was arraigned in the Rensselaer County District Court and charged with 3 of the murders. Later, he was transferred to Albany County Jail, where he was charged with violating his parole in the local court. 2 days later, on the way to Troy and passing over the Menon's Bridge, Evans, despite being handcuffed and shackled, used a hidden key concealed in his nostril to unlock his restraints. He then shattered the window of the transport vehicle and jumped out. Although the police quickly cornered him, he managed to run to the edge of the bridge and leaped over. However, instead of landing in the center of the river, he struck the shallow waters below. In the end, he sustained a fatal head injury and died instantly. Given the circumstances, his death was ruled a suicide. Horton, Evans' attorney and investigator, along with several other acquaintances, stated that Evans had planned his suicide well before the incident. He had sent them a suicide note expressing remorse and his inability to cope with the pain of loneliness. Later, Evans' neighbor called Horton to inform him that Evans had a will, in which he requested to be cremated, and expressed a desire for Horton to receive his ashes. Evans' story, like his life, was fraught with contradictions and complexities. He was a soul struggling in the darkness, choosing death as a means to end his suffering, a final release from his inner turmoil, and a punishment for his crimes. Over a criminal career spanning 20 to 40 years, Charles Ray Hatcher continuously carried out crimes including kidnapping, rape, and murder. Labels like sadist, paranoid schizophrenic are not enough to describe Hatcher's evil nature. Words cannot accurately describe what this type of person truly is. Although he is of the human race, his behavior is more like a beast. Hatcher's criminal story is not just a case about a serial killer. It also profoundly reveals many loopholes in the judicial system and parole boards in assessing, supervising, and managing high-risk offenders. In the end, his suicide was a lie. It was another murder case. On July 16, 1929, Hatcher was born in Mound City, Missouri. His parents had 4 children, with Hatcher being the youngest. His father, Jesse, was a notorious criminal with a criminal record of smuggling and an alcoholic, who often abused Hatcher and his siblings. In the spring of 1936, 6-year-old Hatcher and his brothers were playing in their neighborhood when they came across some copper wire. His 7-year-old brother, Alan, had the idea to use it to fly a kite. He picked up the wire and attached it to the kite. However, with no adult around to warn them of the danger, the children were completely unaware that copper wire could conduct electricity. While the boys ran carelessly along the road, Alan accidentally let the wire touch a high-voltage power line. Just in few seconds, his skin turned charred, his heart stopped, and his breathing ceased. His body grew rigid before collapsing to the ground, motionless. After the accident, Hatcher's parents had a fierce argument. His personality also became weak, and he was filled with fear and helplessness. When he entered school, he was always bullied by his peers. Although the teasing and bullying made him feel deeply helpless, inheriting his father's violent genes, he did not choose silence but responded in a wrong way by bullying weaker classmates, and this vicious cycle continued into his adulthood. Several years later, Hatcher's father left home and divorced his mother. During this time, his mother remarried several times. In 1945, Hatcher and his mother, along with her third husband, moved to St. Joseph, which was 34 miles away from Mound City. 2 years later, young Hatcher began working at the Iowa-Missouri Walnut Company. However, this job did not bring about any positive changes in his life. Instead, he made an impulsive decision. He stole a logging truck and attempted to flee St. Joseph. Without a plan, Hatcher was quickly apprehended. However, since he was not yet 18 years old, the court only sentenced him to 2 years of probation. This was the first time in Hatcher's life that he faced legal consequences for a crime, but unfortunately, it was not the last one. Just 1 year later, in 1948, Hatcher made the same mistake again. He stole a Buick in St. Joseph. This time, without the protection of the juvenile justice system, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, beginning his incarceration at the Missouri State Penitentiary. On June 8, 1949, Hatcher was released from prison early. However, just a few months later, he was arrested again for passing a counterfeit $10 check at a gas station in Maryville. This time, he was sentenced to an additional 2 years in prison. On March 18, 1951, Hatcher attempted to escape from prison and committed a burglary, but his plan failed and he was arrested once more, receiving another 2-year sentence. On July 14, 1954, Hatcher finally completed his additional sentence and walked out of the prison gates again. However, prison life did not lead him to reform. Shortly thereafter, he stole a Ford in Orick and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. While awaiting sentencing, he tried to escape from the Ray County Jail in Richmond, but his escape plan failed again, and then, in addition to the 4-year sentence, he was given an extra 2 years in prison. On March 18, 1959, Hatcher experienced his 6th imprisonment and was finally released again. This time, his crimes escalated to assault and kidnapping. On June 26th, he attempted to kidnap a 16-year-old paperboy named Stephen. He threatened Stephen with a butcher knife. Fortunately, Stephen managed to escape and report the incident to the police. Several hours later, Hatcher was arrested when the police were investigating a stolen vehicle. This time, Hatcher was sentenced to 5 years in prison under the Habitual Offender Act, with charges of attempted kidnapping and auto theft. While waiting to be transferred to prison, Hatcher once again attempted to escape. However, fate seemed to be against him, and his plan failed once more. Upon entering the Missouri State Penitentiary, he claimed to be the most notorious criminal in northwest Missouri since Jesse James. Jesse James was Hatcher's father. No one knows if Jesse was a source of enduring pain or secret pride to Hatcher. But one thing is certain, he was the primary reason Hatcher embarked on a life of crime. On July 2, 1961, a shocking murder occurred in the Missouri State Penitentiary. A 26-year-old inmate named Jerry Tharrington was found raped and stabbed to death on the floor of the prison kitchen loading dock. First, Hatcher was one of the kitchen workers in the prison. Second, at the time of the murder, Hatcher was the only kitchen worker missing, which made him the prime suspect, and he was almost considered to be involved in the murder. So, the prison staff placed Hatcher in solitary confinement. During his time in solitary confinement, he wrote a note claiming that he needed psychiatric treatment. The prison psychologist did not believe his story and thought it was just a trick he was using to get out of prison early. Despite strong suspicion against him, Hatcher could not be convicted in court due to insufficient evidence. Therefore, he was sent back to the general prison population, and his sentence was reduced to 3/4 of the original time. On August 24, 1963, Hatcher was released from prison again. 6 years later, on August 27, 1969, 12-year-old William disappeared after school. His family and friends searched frantically, but in the end, all they found was tragedy. Hatcher later admitted that he lured William to go with him, took him to a creek, and then brutally strangled him to death. Just 2 days later, 6-year-old Gilbert vanished in San Francisco. According to the little girl he had been playing with, Gilbert followed a man who offered him ice cream. Fortunately, he was discovered by a man walking his dog, who found him being beaten and sexually assaulted. The police quickly arrived on the scene and arrested the attacker. He identified himself as Albert Price, but his identification card bore the name Robert Peder. Later, it was confirmed by the FBI that both Price and Peder were aliases used by Hatcher. At that time, Hatcher was charged with assault, attempted sodomy, and kidnapping. He was ordered to undergo a competency evaluation to determine whether he was fit to stand trial. However, during the initial evaluation, Hatcher was unusually silent, so the evaluators decided to conduct a comprehensive psychological assessment. During the assessment, Hatcher claimed to hear voices and reported having delusions and suicidal attempts. So the police and the court were unable to proceed with the trial. Over the next 2 years, Hatcher shuttled back and forth between the court and the hospital. During this period, a psychiatrist diagnosed him with a passive-aggressive personality, along with mental disorders of sexual inversion and pedophilia. Hospital staff suspected that Hatcher was fabricating or exaggerating his symptoms of mental illness. So, in January 1971, Hatcher was examined by 2 psychiatrists. The first one declared him mentally deranged and recommended intensive treatment in a secure hospital, while the second one declared him unfit to stand trial and sent him back to the hospital. On May 24, 1971, Hatcher's trial began. Standing in the courtroom, he presented the evaluations from the 2 psychiatrists, claiming that he was mentally deranged and unable to plead guilty. To ensure the accuracy of the evaluations, Hatcher was sent to another hospital for further assessments, where he was once again determined to be unfit to stand trial. On June 2nd, he eluded the supervision of the hospital staff and escaped. A week later, he was arrested in Colusa, California. During this arrest, Hatcher falsely claimed that his name was Richard Lee Grady. After the police exposed his lie, he was sent back to the state hospital in California for another psychiatric evaluation. In April 1972, the staff at the state hospital determined that his treatment had been unsuccessful and that he posed a danger to other patients. So he was transferred to the Prison State Hospital in Vacaville. 4 months later, Hatcher was moved to San Quentin State Prison to stand trial again. He was ordered to undergo 2 psychiatric evaluations. The first confirmed that Hatcher was competent to stand trial, while the second determined that he was sane at the time of the crimes. In January 1973, Hatcher was sent to the California State Hospital as a sexually disordered person. However, despite his current identity as Peder, Hatcher still harbored the desire for freedom. On March 28th, a security guard found Hatcher hiding inside a cooler near the hospital's main courtyard, with 2 sheets stuffed in his pants to help him climb over the barbed wire fence. After being deemed by doctors to still pose a threat to society, Hatcher was once again sent back to court for sentencing. In April, Hatcher was sentenced to 1 year to life and was sent to a medium-security prison in Vacaville. 1 month later, a psychologist found Hatcher to be a manipulative, institutionalized sociopath. As a result, the psychologist recommended transferring him to a maximum security prison. However, upon hearing this news, Hatcher attempted suicide by slashing his wrists. Later, a psychiatrist diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, and he remained at Vacaville. In August 1975, guards reported that his parole review performance was satisfactory, and a year later, the California Parole Board confirmed that his condition had indeed improved significantly. And they set his parole date for December 25, 1978. Due to the passage of a bill that allowed the time served by inmates in both prison and mental hospitals to be credited toward their sentences, he was released to a halfway house in San Francisco on May 20, 1977. But for Hatcher, new starts mean new crimes. Over the next 3 years, Hatcher, under the alias Richard Clark, continuously committed offenses and was admitted to mental institutions. First time, he was arrested for sexually assaulting a 16-year-old teenager. Second time, he was apprehended for attempting to stab a 7-year-old boy. Third time, he was taken into custody for an attempted assault and sodomy on a 17-year-old teenager. However, before committing these crimes, Hatcher had already committed a murder. On May 26, 1978, 4-year-old Eric vanished in the downtown area of St. Joseph, Missouri. In the end, his body was discovered along the banks of the Missouri River. He had suffered sexual abuse and died from asphyxiation amid extreme agony. The police launched a swift investigation, questioning over 100 potential suspects, including all known individuals with criminal records in the town, but they never found concrete evidence. Among the over 100 potential suspects was a man named Melvin Reynolds. At 25 years old, his intelligence and sexual orientation had been affected by the sexual abuse he endured during childhood. However, these circumstances, along with his homosexual experiences, led the police to suspect that he was the killer. Melvin, with limited intelligence, although uneasy about the investigation, still underwent multiple interrogations over several months, including 2 polygraph tests and 1 hypnotic interrogation. In December 1978, Melvin underwent his first hypnotic interrogation, during which the police administered amibarbital to him. In those days, this drug was referred to by the police as a truth serum, as they believed it could relax and calm a person, thereby eliciting a truthful confession from the suspect. However, in reality, the drug could cause hallucinations and memory impairment, and suggestive questioning by the interrogator could implant false memories in the suspect's mind. During that interrogation, influenced by the drug, Melvin made some ambiguous statements, which further intensified the police's suspicions. 2 months later, the police brought Melvin in for a second round of interrogation, which lasted 14 hours and was filled with promises and threats. Under the immense pressure from the interrogators, Melvin, with his limited intelligence, succumbed and said, "I'll say so if you want me to." In the following weeks, Melvin embellished his confession with details that the police had intentionally or unintentionally provided to him, which was enough to persuade the prosecutor to charge him. In the end, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. On July 29, 1982, 11-year-old Michelle went missing, vanishing in the downtown area of St. Joseph, Missouri, just like Eric had. The next day, her uncle found her naked and ravaged body on the banks of the Missouri River. She had been beaten and strangled to death. Meanwhile, Hatcher was arrested by the police while registering at the state hospital in St. Joseph, though details of his arrest were not disclosed. While awaiting trial, Hatcher confessed to 15 additional murders dating back to 1969. He stated that his first victim was 12-year-old William, and to substantiate his claims, Hatcher drew an extremely rudimentary map that guided searchers to the remains of 28-year-old James Churchill, who was buried in Davenport, Iowa. And then, he admitted to the murder of Eric, leading to the release of Melvin from prison. Although Hatcher confessed to multiple murders, he was only charged with 2 counts of murder, those of Michelle and Eric. In October 1983, he was convicted of Eric's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 50 years before parole eligibility. In 1984, he was convicted a second time in Missouri for the murder of Michelle. He requested the death penalty, but the jury refused and recommended a life sentence on December 3rd. 4 days later, the notorious Hatcher was found dead in his solitary confinement cell at Missouri State Penitentiary. Although his hanging was ruled a suicide, some inmates called into a local radio talk show to insist that Hatcher had been murdered. December 7th, 1984, Hatcher's death day. His life was filled with lies, deceit, and sin. It was a journey steeped in darkness and tragedy. Hatcher's actions not only brought pain to countless families, but also mired him in a quagmire of evil from which he could not extricate himself. Each of his arrests and releases seemed like a last chance granted by fate, yet he never managed to seize them. Before starting this video, what kind of person do you think will report the location of the victim's body to the police after committing murder? Sacramento, located in central California, near the confluence of the Sacramento River and the American River. It is the state capital with a strong police force and public security system, but also has a disturbing dark side. Several notorious serial killers have inflicted endless fear and suffering upon the residents of this city. The Golden State Killer Joseph targeted couples in his crimes, deriving twisted pleasure from sexual assault and murder. His modus operandi was extremely brutal. He would tie up the male in the bedroom and then take the female to another room to assault her sexually. During that time, the male could only endure extreme mental torment, while the female suffered abuse. Even those who were not killed by him also had their spirits shattered. The vampire of Sacramento, Richard Chase, his crimes were more terrible, and what he did was the most primitive horror. After killing people, Richard would drink their blood, eat their internal organs. Police even found human tissues and brains in his refrigerator. However, in addition to Joseph and Richard, Sacramento also had another lesser-known serial killer. He was called the Sacramento Slayer, active between 1986 and 1987, and brutally murdered 7 local women. This man was Morris Solomon Jr., a man from Albany, Georgia. Just like the question at the beginning of the video, for some unknown reason, he suddenly reported to the police the location where he had hidden the body of his victim. On June 18, 1986, Sacramento police received a disturbing call. Someone said that he had smelled the odor of decaying corpse. The person who reported the body was Morris, a handyman who worked near Oak Park. He claimed in the call, while repairing a house, he had smelled a nauseating odor, and as a Vietnam War veteran, he was certain that it was the smell of decaying corpse. However, when the police arrived at the scene, they found the situation to be far more complicated than what Morris had described. The victim was a sex worker named Johnson, who was also a drug user. Her body was tightly bound with ropes, half naked, grotesquely lying in a cupboard. Just 1 month later, on July 20th, another female body was discovered. This time, the corpse was found near a collapsed house. The victim was a 25-year-old woman named Angela, who was also a sex worker and drug user. Her body was bound and wrapped in bedding, clearly having been deliberately concealed. As investigations and confirmations progressed, the police found that both victims seemed to have some connection with Morris, who had reported the discovery of Johnson's body. Her time of death was just a few days before Morris made the report, during which time Morris had been conducting repair work in that house. Although Angela's case initially appeared unrelated to Morris, subsequent investigations revealed that he had once lived in that house. Eliminating all possibilities of coincidence, some police officers believed that Morris might have reported the location of Johnson's body in an attempt to mislead the police, making them think he was a concerned citizen rather than a killer. Given these suspicions, police brought Morris to the interrogation room, and there, his behavior seemed to confirm their suspicions. Firstly, Morris was unable to accurately provide his own identity information, and his statements were riddled with contradictions. However, despite some police officers being convinced that Morris was the killer, without solid evidence, they could not detain or arrest him. They could only take Morris's fingerprints and blood samples. In early 1987, Sacramento was home to 2 serial killers. One of them was Dorothea, who ran a boarding house, specifically catering to the elderly, frail, drug and alcohol addicts, and those with mental health issues who were homeless. These unfortunate individuals became her victims, and their remains were buried in her backyard. Moreover, the reason Morris's serial murders did not attract much attention was that a year after his arrest, Dorothea was also apprehended by the police. As one of the most notorious female serial killers in American history, second only to Eileen, The sensational nature of her case completely overshadowed the serial murders committed by Morris. The other serial killer was Morris, whose crimes had yet to be discovered by the police. On March 19th, in the basement of a house near Oak Park in Sacramento, a female body wrapped in a bedsheet was discovered. Upon identification, the victim was a woman named Maria, who was also a sex worker and drug user. At this point, the police had already realized that a serial killer was active near Oak Park in Sacramento. The three victims shared some disturbing similarities. They were all sex workers and drug users, had been bound in a similar manner, and their remains were found partially naked. These details led the police to conclude that there was only one killer behind these cases. After Maria's body was found, the police once again brought Morris to the interrogation room. There, the man provided some false statements, but his lies were quickly refuted by the police. Eventually, Morris admitted that he had given vague information about his identity because he had 4 outstanding arrest warrants, so he chose to lie in an attempt to evade the police investigation. In reality, since the discovery of the first victim, despite the police's extreme suspicion of Morris, he had cooperated with them. On April 20th of the same year, he agreed to let police search his abandoned car in the area where he lived. But when the police arrived at the scene, they immediately noticed a distinct depression in the soil near the abandoned car, so they grabbed a few shovels and began to dig. As time went on, their efforts were rewarded with a shocking discovery. They found the body of 26-year-old Washington. Unlike the previous victims, she was the only one woman without a prostitution record. Her body was also half-naked and tightly bound with ropes. 2 days later, the police discovered 2 more victims behind an aging shack associated with Morris. Linda, 24-year-old, Sheila, 17-year-old, had been dead for about a year. In the following days, the police also found Sharon's body near the burial site of Maria. At that time, there was no direct evidence proving that Morris was the killer. There were no fingerprints or DNA traces. The police and prosecution mainly based their charges on 2 points. First, almost all the victims were found near places where Morris had lived, and some sex workers and other witnesses testified that Morris was the last person the victims had contact with before their deaths. During the trial, Morris's defense attorneys proposed an extensive plan for mitigation of punishment. Over the course of 7 days, they found 18 witnesses to testify, attempting to reveal the complex psychology behind Morris's crimes. Their strategy was to attribute Morris's actions to the abuse he suffered in his childhood, his service in Vietnam, and the effects of cocaine use. 2 forensic clinical psychologists testified that the abuse Morris endured in his childhood led to mental, emotional, and behavioral issues in his adulthood, which had an undeniable connection to his crimes. Despite the efforts of the defense attorneys which led to the dismissal of the murder charge against Morris in the Angela case, he was still convicted of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Later, although his death penalty trial was declared a mistrial, in July 1992, the second jury unanimously voted to sentence Morris to death again. When the details of the case were made public, some of Morris's surviving victims came forward and bravely shared their experiences, allowing people to better understand the brutality of this serial killer. 18-year-old Mary testified that she was stabbed with a knife by Morris on September 19, 1969. Dale testified that Morris kicked her in the face on May 17, 1971. Connie described the nightmare of October 18, 1975, when Morris put a chain around her neck, choked her, assaulted and raped her, and urinated on her face. In addition to these cases, Morris was convicted of felony assault and false imprisonment in 1977. He was also charged with the murder of a masseuse, but was acquitted due to the absence of the prosecution's witness. In 1984, Morris was sentenced in Arizona for 3 counts of grand theft. Ultimately, Morris became the 342nd person sentenced to death in the state and was incarcerated on death row at San Quentin Prison. On July 15, 2010, the California Supreme Court reaffirmed his conviction once again. Only a few people knew that Morris was not only a convicted criminal with a history of sexual assault and brutality, but also had been institutionalized in a state mental hospital, where he was diagnosed as a criminally insane individual. As Morris's defense attorneys argued, Morris's story is one filled with pain and darkness, with his life trajectory largely overshadowed by the shadows of his childhood. On March 15, 1944, Morris was born in a remote rural area of Georgia, where he also spent his childhood. His grandmother, Bertha, took on the responsibility of raising him, but unfortunately, her parenting was characterized by violence. As a child, Morris would often wet the bed, which should have been a normal occurrence for any child, but Bertha used it as an excuse to abuse him. She would place the young Morris across her lap and mercilessly raise her hand, striking him over and over again. Sometimes, a mispronunciation on his part would also become a reason for Bertha to vent her anger. Even Morris's instinctive crying during the abuse was seen by Bertha as a provocation, which only led her to become more violent. Bertha's methods of abuse were cruel and varied. She would order Morris to strip naked, stand on a stool, and then take a wire and lash out at his exposed body, focusing particularly on his genital. Sometimes, Bertha's violent outbursts were without any reason. She would suddenly fly into a rage, tie Morris's hands to the bedpost to prevent him from retreating during the beating. During the first 13 years of Morris's life, he had very little contact with his parents. They seemed like distant strangers, their figures blurred in his memory. It wasn't until the day when Bertha and the family moved to Ileton, a small farming town 40 miles south of Sacramento, that Morris finally reunited with his parents. However, this so-called reunion brought Morris no warmth, but instead plunged him into an even more chaotic and painful world. In Ileton, there was an area known as Cannery Row and Tin Pan Alley. It was impoverished and dilapidated, with run-down houses lining the streets. Morris's family was one of the few African-American families in this small town, and they lived in that very place. In there, Morris witnessed his parents' mutual verbal abuse, physical fights, and even incidents of sexual violence. His mother and grandmother would also beat and berate him in public, with no regard for his feelings. Some relatives described Morris's mother as a promiscuous woman who was aggressive and lacked empathy, and who engaged with different men as a sex worker. Despite the difficult environment in which he grew up, Morris still tried to move forward. After graduating from high school, he entered a community college and attempted various jobs, including carpentry, auto repair, and bus driving. Later, he enlisted in the military. Starting in the summer of 1966, he served in Vietnam for a year during the Vietnam War. In the summer of 1967, he was discharged as a sergeant and returned to Ileton. During this time, Morris had become engaged to a girl he had met before going to Vietnam, but for some reason, the girl broke off the engagement. Later, Morris moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, where he got married and had a daughter. However, due to the impact of both his family life and the war, his mental state became very unstable. After committing some minor offenses, his wife divorced him and took their daughter away. In the end, Morris moved back to Sacramento. There, he found work as a handyman, repairing old houses in exchange for free room and board, and began his career as a killer. In Morris's previous appeal, his lawyers mentioned his experience in Vietnam. They said that during those chaotic times, soldiers could cheaply hook up with Vietnamese women anywhere, even in the battle zone. These young women were also victims of the war. They were treated as objects and toys by soldiers. Like many other soldiers, Morris slowly lost his way in that environment. On August 1st, 2024, at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, California, Morris was declared dead. But his death was not a simple natural demise, but rather concealed some inside story. According to insiders from the institution, a death row inmate, William Ramos, had struck Morris on the head with a metal object, causing him to die from blunt force trauma to the back of his head. William, 72 years old, had been sentenced to death for the murder of 3 women. An email revealed more of the inside story, including that on June 26th, Morris had a physical altercation with William and was sent to an external medical facility for emergency care. Morris returned to prison on July 29th and was declared dead on August 1st. Miami is one of Florida's major cities, and it has a thriving economy that attracts people from neighboring countries like Cuba and Colombia to try to illegally enter Miami in pursuit of the American dream. However, the arrival of these immigrants has brought some serious problems that cannot be ignored. For instance, violent crime, sex industry, and drug trafficking. Among these problems, sex workers are particularly vulnerable. To make a living, they must entertain numerous clients and endure physical exhaustion and pain. This harsh reality often leads some to drug addiction, which in turn makes them easy prey for serial killers. On September 17, 1994, in the area around Flagami, Miami, a man's body was found in a dimly lit alley. He was dressed in revealing clothing, with heavy makeup on his face and obvious strangulation marks on his neck. Miami police quickly transported the body to the forensic office and began questioning nearby sex workers, trying to identify the victim. Obviously, the revealing clothes and heavy makeup made the police come to the initial conclusion that the victim was a sex worker. After a series of investigations and verifications, the victim's identity was eventually confirmed as Lazaro, a 27-year-old man who used to be a hairdresser. Lazaro harbored a secret deep inside. He believed he was a woman, so he always dressed in women's clothing and asked people to call him Vanessa or Jessica. However, this psychological struggle left Lazaro on the fringes of society. Eventually, due to financial difficulties, Lazaro fell from being a hairdresser to becoming a transgender sex worker, living in a cheap motel room. And the night before his death, Lazaro was still soliciting clients on the street, but no one knows who was his last client. In order to find clues, police went to the motel, and in the room they found some drugs and syringes. In those days, the death of a drug-using sex worker would hardly attract people's attention. Police also would not invest much effort, because no one knew whether his death was related to the drugs. 3 weeks later, on October 8th, another death occurred. Elisa, 44-year-old drug-using sex worker, was found dead. Although her body was found near Florida International University, her death did not receive the attention it deserved. In this area filled with cheap motels, adult stores, and strip clubs, her death was just one of many tragedies. The deaths of the two victims did not attract much people's attention until November 20th, when another naked female body was found on a path in West Dade. The victim was 23-year-old Nava. This case drew high attention from the police and the media because the killer left some sarcastic messages on the victim's back and buttocks. He wrote, "Third, see if you can catch me." The killer did not use the word see, but replaced it with two eye symbols. Obviously, the words reminded the police that Nava was not the only victim. The previous victims were also the killer's prey. Therefore, the police took swift action, trying to find clues from the messages left by the killer. However, the killer seemed to always be one step ahead. 5 days later, on November 25th, another murder occurred. The body of 38-year-old Wanda was found in the parking lot of an apartment building. Unlike the previous victims, Wanda died of suffocation instead of strangulation. Due to the different method of killing, the police initially excluded this murder from the series of serial killings. The Flagami area, Florida International University, West Dade, and the location of Wanda's death. Although the crime scenes of the four victims were not in the same place, a trail connects them all together. Tamiami Trail. Apparently, the killer's active area was around this trail. Although the police had not yet disclosed the existence of a serial killer to the public, residents living in this area had already begun to panic. Wanda's death made them realize that the area was no longer safe. As a result, many residents who worked in the area moved away, fearing that they might become the next victims. On December 19th, the police finally admitted that there was a serial killer on Tamiami Trail, because on this day, another female body was found in a residential area near Tamiami Trail. The victim was 28-year-old Schneider, a homeless person who had been arrested several times for prostitution. Based on the victim's identity and the location where the body was dumped, the police concluded that since September 17th, an unknown serial killer had been committing crimes near the Tamiami Trail, targeting street sex workers. Miami police also set up a temporary command post there to investigate the murder and named the serial killer the Tamiami Trail Strangler. On January 12, 1995, the police found the last victim near the Tamiami Trail. Rhonda, a 21-year-old sex worker, was the victim. In reality, after realizing that the killer specifically targeted sex workers, police had warned the sex workers in the area to stay away from this chaotic region, especially for Rhonda. Just 1 week before she was murdered, a police officer had told her not to continue soliciting clients in there. At the press conference announcing the victim's identity, a senior police officer said that the killer was desperate for attention, but he hadn't received the attention he needed recently. So he tried to attract everyone's attention and prove his existence through this brutal murder. Later, he added, according to the psychological profile of the killer established by the FBI, they describe the attacker as neat-minded, with obsessive-compulsive tendencies, conflict-avoidant, and likely to have a regular job. This means that after the crime he might be exhausted or behave abnormally, and you will find changes in his living habits. He will no longer be the same person. His colleagues, or perhaps important partners in his life, will notice the changes, and this is the kind of clue we hope to receive. This serial murder case also triggered the largest manhunt in the history of Miami-Dade County. During the investigation, more than 100 investigators and FBI profilers worked around the clock, following up on as many as 5,000 leads at a cost of nearly $2 million. However, despite investigating over 1,000 potential suspects, no meaningful results were produced. Nevertheless, police did not give up. They continued to patrol near the Tamiami Trail, and at the same time, through community activities, they called on the public to provide any possible clues. On June 19, 1995, residents of the Trail Highlands Garden Apartments reported to the police that they had heard strange noises coming from their neighbor Rory's apartment. Before long, the police, having received the report, arrived at the scene. Rory was not at home, so they directly broke into the apartment and found a naked, bound woman. She was 30-year-old Gloria. Upon seeing the police, Gloria cried and explained that while soliciting clients, she had encountered Rory. He had paid her and requested that she provide sexual services at his home. However, after the service was over, he had immediately strangled her. Fearing for her life, Gloria pretended to be dead in order to survive. Fortunately, she successfully deceived Rory. Meanwhile, Rory, the owner of the apartment, had just finished a court hearing for a robbery charge unrelated to the case. As he approached his apartment, he noticed that it was surrounded by police. So, he pretended that nothing had happened and left, but his escape could not dispel the police's suspicion. He had become a major suspect. Gloria, a sex worker, being bound, all pointed to the fact that Rory was very likely the Tamiami Trail Strangler. 5 days later, Rory was arrested at his grandmother's house in Hialeah. Police officers also obtained a search warrant to search Rory's apartment and his car. Ultimately, DNA samples linked Rory to 5 of the 6 victims. When the police brought Rory to the interrogation room, Rory appeared unusually calm. Faced with the police's questioning, he voluntarily confessed to his crimes, saying that he was the serial killer who had been committing crimes near the Tamiami Trail. Rory said, "I killed these women because my wife left me. I lost her, so I needed to find a way to fill the emptiness inside." In subsequent interviews, Rory even claimed that he had engaged in sexual intercourse with the corpse of one of the victims. The arrest also shocked Rory's neighbors and friends. In their eyes, Rory was a quiet, normal, and family-loving man. Although he seemed to become more reticent after his wife left him, no one ever thought that he was a serial killer. One neighbor recalled, "We thought he was just going through a tough time." However, the police found a chilling fact from the behavior of Rory's friends and neighbors. It turned out that Rory was able to escape the police for so long because his friends and neighbors had seen him behave strangely many times, but never reported it to the police. Once, the neighbors saw Rory stealthily peering into a young woman's bedroom in the early morning hours. On another occasion, the neighbors saw he dragged a suitcase containing unknown contents to his car in the night. What's more shocking is that during a discussion with colleagues about the ongoing manhunt, Rory referred to the killer as a smart person the police would never catch, and no one doubted Rory's words. Later, Rory was charged with 6 counts of murder, 2 counts of rape, and 1 count of theft. Before his trial, a Spanish-language newspaper obtained court records of Rory's confession. The records revealed that he had talked to the victims' corpses and blamed them for the misfortunes in his life. Several lawyers later said that because of Rory's confession and too much evidence against him, they tried to make Rory's confession inadmissible in court on the grounds that the police had not fully informed Rory of his right to hire lawyers. However, the prosecutors pointed out that the police had treated Rory well on several occasions, even allowing him to call his family and giving him bathroom privileges before he decided to plead guilty. In October 1999, Rory went on trial for the murder of Rhonda. Due to the complexity and severity of the case, he had to be tried separately for each murder, and the first trial was for Rhonda's murder. The violent and brutal way Rhonda was killed drew great people attention. When Rory remained silent, the judge read that the autopsy showed Rhonda's body had 30 neck fractures. In the end, Rory was found guilty of murdering Rhonda and was sentenced to death. In 2001, as part of a plea agreement, Rory admitted to the remaining 5 murders. In exchange, he was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole and was prohibited from trying to overturn the sentences. Rory said that he killed these women because his wife had left him. His words seemed as if he was the real victim. However, such words only made people more convinced that his words were full of lies. But to fully understand Rory's behavior, one needs to go back to his past, June 14, 1965, the day he was born. He was born in Barranquilla, Colombia, and his life was filled with hardships from the moment he was born. When Rory was only 6 months old, his mother passed away from tetanus, leaving him and his sister to be raised by their grandmother, Maria. At the age of 12, Rory's life took a turn when he and his sister moved to Miami to live with their father. At that time, his father was an airline employee who had recently remarried, and the relationship between Rory and his father was not harmonious. Rory felt that his father was extremely emotionally distant and even abusive towards him, while his father believed that his son was just introverted and too lonely. It is said that Rory was sexually abused by 2 of his uncles, which led to severe depression, post-traumatic stress, and issues with low self-esteem. Rory's future wife, Carla, thought that Rory's angry outbursts might be the result of sexual abuse by his father, but these claims were never verified. Rory and Carla's love story began in 1985. At the time, 20-year-old Rory met 15-year-old Carla through a friend party. 2 years later, they got married and eventually had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Although many neighbors thought Rory was a friendly and helpful person, the arguments between Rory and Carla were already an open secret, as they often escalated into violent conflicts. Once, when Carla was pregnant, Rory drove her out of the apartment naked. In 1989, the couple moved into their own apartment, after which Rory's abusive behavior became more frequent. He repeatedly punched, kicked, and choked Carla, threatened her, and even pointed a gun at her. One evening in 1991, Carla came home early from work. While cleaning the apartment, she found a videotape in the VCR. Out of curiosity, she played it and was shocked to see another woman wearing her lingerie, masturbating in bed. When Carla confronted Rory about it, he not only failed to provide a reasonable explanation, but also attacked her. Over the next 3 years, Rory and Carla went through multiple breakups and reconciliations. Gradually, Rory stopped having sexual relations with Carla and began to leave home frequently, claiming he was going fishing in the Florida Keys. However, that was not the case. In mid-1993, Carla decided to follow Rory after work and saw that Rory was actually peeping into the bedrooms of young women, watching them and masturbate. In early 1994, Rory became a salesman for building supplies. His colleagues at the company had a fairly positive opinion of him, describing him as helpful and outgoing. However, they were unaware of his violent behavior towards Carla and his frequent peeping at young women. Around July of that year, Carla finally made up her mind to leave Rory and took their 2 children with her. In a fit of anger, Rory threatened her, saying that if she dared to date another man, he would kill her. A month later, Rory tried to force Carla to come back to him, but she firmly refused and made it clear that she wanted a divorce. As a result, Rory's mental state deteriorated completely. A month later, he went to the red light district, looking for a sex worker to satisfy his physical needs. However, the sex worker he found was Lazaro, a man disguised as a woman. He paid for sexual services, but during the encounter, he discovered that Lazaro was a man. Driven by some kind of rage, Rory strangled Lazaro and killed him. According to Rory's confession, after killing Lazaro, he knelt on his body for 10 minutes, blaming Lazaro for making him lose his wife and children. In 1995, a few months after Rory's arrest, sex workers on the streets of Miami were once again plunged into a shadow of terror. A new demon had extended its evil claws towards these people who were struggling to survive on the fringes of society. In August, the body of the first victim was found in the Alapata neighborhood of Miami. The victim was 43-year-old Vida from North Carolina. During an interview, a police officer claimed that the Alapata neighborhood was known for drug users, and he believed that Vida might have chosen to set herself on fire after having hallucinations from drug use. However, the forensics report showed that Vida had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, which clearly indicated that Vida was not a suicide but had been brutally murdered. 2 months later, the police found another body just 100 yards from where Vida had been discovered. The second victim was 44-year-old Diane, a drug user who had been wandering the streets for 15 years. Her body also bore signs of having been bludgeoned with a blunt object and then set on fire. Initially, her identity could not be determined due to the damage caused by the fire. It was only after the forensic used dental records and licenses that her identity was finally confirmed. 3 months later, on January 25, 1996, the body of 37-year-old Cheryl was found in the Old City Cemetery in Miami. Her body had suffered severe blunt force trauma, and there were obvious signs of burns. Shortly after, the police received a report of another body found in an abandoned gas station. Like Vida, Diane, and Cheryl, this victim was also found half naked, with signs of blunt force trauma to the head and burns on the body. The victim was identified as 37-year-old Janice, a woman with mental issues and a drug addiction. Notably, investigators found a set of male footprints near the scene of Janice's death. All the victims had similar lifestyles: prostitution, drug addiction, and homelessness. The similarities in these cases led the police to realize that a serial killer might be active in the Alapata neighborhood and the surrounding streets. After Cheryl's body was discovered, the local police department established a special task force dedicated to investigating these cases. They deployed 100 investigators, conducted extensive inquiries among local sex workers and drug users, involving approximately 500 individuals. They also collected 10,000 pages of suspect information, most of which turned out to be false. However, based on the leads they gathered, they created a composite sketch of a person nicknamed Fear, whom they believed to be the suspect. One police officer stated that a witness had seen him with the body shortly after the third victim's body was discovered. He believed that this person nicknamed Fear could also be a witness, but he added, "We don't know if he's a suspect in the killings or a witness to the killings. All we know is that we need to talk to him." On one afternoon, a woman flagged down a patrol car on the street. She told the police officers that a man had tried to lure her closer and wanted to attack her with a blunt object. Fortunately, she managed to escape before the attacker could strike. The officers comforted her, encouraging her to go about her life and reminding her to call the police immediately if she saw the man again. At that time, no one could have thought that the woman had helped the police arrest the murderer. Not long after, the woman found the man who was trying to attack her. She waved to the patrol car without hesitation and pointed at the man. The police officers responded quickly. They immediately stopped a middle-aged bald man riding a bicycle, and his name was Francisco. After a preliminary examination, the two police officers realized that they might really have caught the culprit. There was a container full of gasoline and matches in the bag on the back seat of Francisco's bicycle. When asked why he was carrying gasoline, Francisco tried to explain, "Oh, my bicycle chain occasionally falls off. When I repair it, my hands get covered in grease. So I need gasoline to clean the grease off my hands." However, this excuse was clearly unconvincing. Because the police had already documented the footprints left by the murderer, they asked to inspect the soles of Francisco's shoes. After a careful comparison, they found that Francisco's footprints matched the murderer's exactly, and then he was taken to the Miami Downtown Police Department for further interrogation. In the interrogation room, a police officer observed that Francisco showed hardly a trace of remorse in his demeanor. He appeared cunning and methodical, as if every move he made was carefully planned. When the police asked him about his thoughts on the murders of women who were beaten to death and then burned, Francisco merely downplayed it, saying that the murders were indeed terrible. The first interrogation mainly focused on Francisco's childhood in Cuba and his personal preferences. From his account of his childhood, the police learned that his comfort zone was the beach. To understand his psychological state, the police took him to the beach on Biscayne Bay. There, the police and Francisco were drinking coffee from Cuba and looking at the sea, and then Francisco admitted that he was the killer of the 4 victims. On August 3, 1957, Francisco was born in Cuba. He was the first child in a family that had long been plagued by mental illness. From a young age, he was ostracized and avoided by his peers, with loneliness and helplessness accompanying his growth. His father was mostly away working, and when he came home, he would abuse him. In such a family environment, the only place where Francisco felt safe was on the Cuban beach with his mother. And in reality, from the age of 3, Francisco began taking anti-epileptic drugs. By the age of 16, he started experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations. Hallucinations that led him to firmly believe that everyone around him was somehow hurting him. Francisco told the police that he heard the voice of Santeria, the voice of a religious witch. The witch had black facial paint, which also explained why his victims were all black women. After admitting to being the murderer, the police took Francisco to the crime scenes. There, he meticulously reenacted each crime, providing details that only the murderer would know. In May 2003, a court hearing was held for Francisco's case. The court ruled that due to his severe mental illness, they could not sentence him to death for the 4 murders. In the end, Francisco was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. After World War II, the crime rate in the United States soared rapidly, reaching its peak in the 1970s and the 1990s. Meanwhile, this period was also a time when serial killers were extremely rampant, with various notorious serial killers constantly appearing in people's eyes. For example, Ted Bundy, who committed murders and rapes across multiple states. Green River Killer, who indiscriminately murdered women and claimed to be cleaning up society's trash. Richard Chase, who liked to eat the victim's internal organs and blood. In reality, in those days, there was also a highly skilled and extremely brutal serial killer lurking. In the early stages of his criminal career, he was not particularly noticeable, primarily gaining experience in breaking into people's homes through theft. As time went on, he became dissatisfied with mere theft and gradually shifted his targets to single women, broke into their residences to commit sexual assaults. Later, his behavior became even more brutal, and his targets expanded beyond single women to include couples and married couples. He would carry a handgun, break into the victims' homes, force the women to tie up their partners, and then sexually assault the women. In the end, his criminal activities reached a climax because he began to kill the victims. It is worth noting that at first, the police were misled by his different targets and scattered crime locations, believing that these cases were committed by 3 different criminals. They separated these cases and named them the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the original Night Stalker, respectively. In the early 1970s, Visalia, California was a quiet town. Agriculture dominated the area, with farms and ranches dotting the surrounding countryside. But this small town harbored a peculiar and puzzling phenomenon. Nearly all the houses had no windows. This situation arose from the unique economic conditions of the time. In those days, glass was prohibitively expensive due to high tariffs. Furthermore, the price of hiring local carpenters was high, and they were very arrogant and rude. Without windows, the interior of the houses would be extremely dim, so the Visalia residents never locked their doors. While this lifestyle reflected the town's tranquility and safety, this lack of vigilance also made it the perfect place for thieves to gain experience in burglary. From 1974 to 1975, a series of unusual thefts occurred in here. In some homes, piggy banks and coin jars were ransacked. Strangely, valuable items were left untouched. What's more, it seemed that the intruder was not satisfied with mere theft. He would meticulously arrange or display items in the victim homes, even move window screens to beds or bedrooms, leaving obvious traces. Clearly, these actions bear little resemblance to the typical methods of a thief. They do not resemble the impulsive, opportunistic actions of a random burglar, but rather the calculated, premeditated actions of a predator. So the intruder was given a nickname, the Visalia Ransacker. The first recorded burglary committed by the Visalia Ransacker took place on March 19, 1974, when a resident's piggy bank containing $50 in coins was stolen. Later, similar home burglaries began to occur frequently, especially on November 30, 1974, when 12 burglaries took place within a single day. Snelling, a 45-year-old and highly respected journalism professor, was awakened around 2 o'clock in the morning on September 11, 1975, by a strange noise. He got out of his bedroom and saw the back door wide open. Following the source of the sound, Snelling ran to the carport and found an attacker wearing a ski mask attempting to kidnap his daughter. The attacker, holding a gun, threatened to kill the girl if she didn't shut up. Seeing his daughter about to be harmed, Snelling didn't hesitate to rush forward and try to protect her. However, 2 bullets struck Snelling's body, instantly draining him of his strength. Staggering back to the bedroom, he told his wife to call the police. In the end, Snelling died, and the attacker beat Snelling's daughter and then fled the scene. Around 8:30 p.m. on December 12, 1975, an intruder broke into the backyard of a house in Visalia, near where the Visalia ransacker was known to frequent. William, an experienced police officer, was in the garage on surveillance when he spotted the intruder. Immediately, William drew his pistol, attempting to apprehend him. Just as William was about to seize the intruder, the man stopped, raised his hands above his head, and feigned surrender. However, just as William let his guard down, the intruder pulled out a revolver and fired at William, shattering his flashlight. Although the arrival of nearby police officers to help William, the intruder managed to escape. In the end, the police only found fragments of the flashlight at the scene, tracks of tennis shoes, and the intruder's dropped loot, some blue chip stamps, and a sock filled with coins. On June 18, 1976, around 5 in the morning, Phyllis, age 23, trembled as she called the Sacramento County Police Department's emergency line. She claimed that she had been attacked and sexually assaulted in her home. The details of this case were repeatedly mentioned by the police in the days that followed. The attacker wore a ski mask and gloves throughout the crime, threatening the victim with a weapon. He applied baby oil in advance as a lubricant, tied up the victim, and then raped her. The attacker's penis was very small, and he would steal inside the house, but he would not take valuable items, only take personal items that were meaningful. Moreover, Phyllis stated that the attacker had already stripped his body before entering her room. For experienced police officers, the implications behind this behavior were self-evident. They concluded that this was a juvenile sex pervert who could not control his sexual impulses, and it was only a matter of time before he was arrested. A criminal profiler once said that most people can easily associate high-intelligence criminals with sophisticated and complex robberies. However, when it comes to rape and torture, people often regard it as a degenerate act and rarely associate it with high intelligence. Therefore, people are reluctant to believe that such criminals possess intelligence, and neither do the police. However, the Sacramento County Police never imagined that they were dealing with anything other than an ordinary rapist. Just 3 months later, on October 5, 1976, the 5th sexual assault took place, with Jane as the victim. Around 6:30 in the morning, Jane's husband had just left for work, and she was still in bed with her 3-year-old son when she suddenly heard the light in the room flickering on and off. Soon after, a man wearing a green mask appeared before her. Later, Jane's son was placed in another room, while she was blindfolded and taken to the living room. During the sexual assault, the man asked Jane, "How does this compare to the captain's?" At the time, Jane's husband held the rank of captain in the Air Force, and the man also kept slapping Jane, saying, "Put some feeling into it, or I'll use a knife." When Jane's 3-year-old son woke up, all he saw was his mother bound with a bath towel, gagged with a cloth, and with marks on her wrists. As time went on, more and more evidence came to light, pointing to an unsettling fact. The attacker's crimes were not random but meticulously planned. For instance, several weeks before Phyllis was assaulted, she received a few mysterious phone calls and seemed to be followed while walking outside. And looking at Jane's case, her husband had just left the house when the attacker entered through the window of the spare bedroom. He was like a cunning nocturnal creature lurking in the shadows, screening victims, studying the structure of houses, familiarizing himself with the daily routines of people in the area, carefully planning the timing of his crimes, and being cautious, patient, and meticulous. Since the attacker always wore a mask and gloves, deliberately lowered his voice when speaking, chose times and rooms with poor lighting for his crimes, And considering that the victim's memories were not entirely reliable, the only features the police knew were that he was about 5 feet 8 inches tall, relatively young, well-built, with well-developed calf muscles and had a small penis. In order to apprehend this rapist, the police embarked on a difficult manhunt. They began by conducting a thorough search of suspects with similar criminal records, inquiring with neighbors in the area, and visiting suspicious individuals such as couriers, milkmen, and cleaners. Police also attempted to reenact the crime scenes, blindfolding Jane and having her listen to recordings of 2 suspects to identify the rapist. Additionally, they carefully searched pawn shops in an effort to locate the stolen items. They even visited an adult store to inquire about customers who showed interest in bondage-related materials. Ultimately, they found that a man had inquired about women's registration information at the Department of Motor Vehicles. However, when the officers interviewed this man at his doorstep, he appeared agitated, stood in a gutter, completely oblivious to the water dirtying his clean leather shoes. This small detail made the police realize that they had the wrong person, and thus, the man's suspicion was dismissed. That October, 500 Sacramento County residents attended an emergency meeting about the serial rapist. They anxiously voiced their fears to police officers, hoping law enforcement would swiftly bring this monster to justice. The next day, a newspaper report struck like a sledgehammer, sending fear soaring once more. The East Area rapist had committed his 8th consecutive assault. In those days, given the attacker's operational territory, he was dubbed the East Area Rapist. The East Area Rapist's targets were relatively focused, mainly on women who were home alone, including a minor girl 15-year-old named Crease. Before Crease was assaulted multiple times, the man left a chilling threat. He said, "Do what I say or I'll kill you and be gone in the dark." At the time of the crime, the girl was playing the piano. Later, she never touched the piano again. Crease said that although it was only a few hours, it changed everything. On March 18, 1977, the Sacramento County Police received a call from a man who claimed to be the East Area Rapist. He taunted the police, saying, "My next victim is already being tracked. You will never catch me." On the same day, the 15th sexual assault took place. Later on, hurt single women and causing them pain no longer satisfied the East Area Rapist. As a result, couples and married couples became his primary targets. On April 2, 1977, he assaulted a couple for the first time. In this attack, he employed a modus operandi that he had never used before, and it turned out that this pattern would reappear in the cases he committed later on. He first made the female victim tie up her male partner in the bedroom. This was not a simple action of binding, but a form of psychological torture. Then, he would stack a pile of plates on the man's back and say, "If I hear any of the plates fall, I'll kill her." After that, he would take the female victim to the next room to commit the sexual assault. During the time, the male partner could only stay in the bedroom, listening to the sounds coming from the next room, feeling his helplessness and despair. According to statistics, the East Area Rapist committed approximately 50 home sexual assaults and 1 murder over a span of 3 years. On February 2, 1978, a couple walking their dog in Cordova Ranch were shot to death. British criminal psychologist David once wrote that a criminal's history is more vulnerable than his future. He believes that the key to solving a series of crimes does not lie in merely the location of the most recent crime, but in delving deeply into what happened before the first crime was committed. David emphasizes that before a criminal actually commits a crime, he may not even know that he will do so. Therefore, his behavior before the crime may not be as cautious as it is afterward. On October 1, 1979, a couple in Santa Barbara County experienced a terrifying night. At the time, an attacker wielding a flashlight woke them up with its beam. The woman was ordered by the attacker to tie up her partner. Then, she was also bound. Later, the attacker began to ransack the room, incessantly opening and closing drawers while demanding cash. However, curiously, he did not seem singularly focused on stealing money. Next, he led the woman to the living room, made her lie face down on the floor, and covered her head with a pair of tennis shorts. The woman could only hear his footsteps pacing around the room. Then, she heard him enter the kitchen, muttering the chilling words, saying, "I will kill them." Hearing these words, a powerful will to survive surged within the woman. She broke free from her bonds, ran out onto the street, and began to scream loudly. Her partner also took the opportunity to escape to the backyard of the house. Perhaps the attacker's reconnaissance work was not successful. The couple's next-door neighbor happened to be an FBI agent. Awakened by the woman's screams, the agent immediately went outside to check the situation and happened to see a man riding a stolen silver bicycle crossing the street. The man was wearing a Pendleton brand shirt and jeans, had a knife strapped to his waist, was wearing tennis shoes, and had brownish hair. After a chase through several streets, his headlights shone on the attacker. However, the attacker was extremely cunning. He decisively abandoned the bicycle, jumped over a fence between two houses, and vanished into the night. After the incident, the attacker was given the nickname Night Stalker. It turned out that the couple was fortunate because nearly 3 months later, another couple was found murdered in their home by the Night Stalker. The victims were a 44-year-old plastic surgeon named Robert and a 35-year-old clinical psychologist named Deborah. In 1980, the Night Stalker moved southward in California. He first killed Charlene and Lyman in Ventura, and then made his way to Dana Point, where Keith and Patrice, a newlywed couple of just 3 months, were murdered by the Night Stalker. At that time, the couple lived in a house owned by Keith's father, Roger. August 19th, Roger, as usual, came to visit his children but heard no sound. When he entered the bedroom, the scene seemed quite ordinary. The bed was neatly made, with the quilt covering all the way to the edge of the dark headboard. Roger thought the children had just gone out. However, as he was about to close the door, a bulge under the quilt caught his attention. He walked over and gently pressed it, feeling something hard. When he lifted the quilt, he saw Keith and Patrice lying there quietly, their arms bent at a strange angle, palms facing up. In this case, the police found signs of death by blunt force trauma. The couple had multiple wounds from being struck with a heavy object on their heads. Apparently, the murderer had used some kind of weight during the crime. On February 6, 1981, 28-year-old Manuela was raped and murdered in her home in Irvine. In fact, this murder completely disrupted the life of her husband David. At the time of the attack, David was hospitalized due to illness and was not with Manuela. However, later on, the police and neighbors always suspected that David was the murderer. But for David, the real murderer, the Night Stalker, had been constantly bothering him, such as following him and frequently calling him. On July 26, 1981, Debbie had a fierce argument with her mother, Sherry. Then, Debbie stormed out of the house in anger. In her last phone call to her mother, she shouted, "Why can't you just get out of my life?" But she didn't know that this would be the last conversation between mother and daughter, because the very next day, her mother was brutally murdered, and along with her, Sherry's ex-boyfriend Gregory also died. The Night Stalker's final crime took place in Irvine, where the victim was Lisa, an 8-year-old whose life had been as tragic as her fate. In reality, Lisa's life was filled with suffering. She had had several stepfathers, each of whom had subjected her to varying degrees of abuse. And her mother's pursuit of pleasure and drugs far outweighed her sense of responsibility towards her family. Because the house was for sale and potential buyers would be coming to view the house, on May 3, 1986, Lisa's parents went on vacation to Mexico, leaving Lisa alone at home to deal with clients interested in purchasing the house. On the morning of May 5th, Linda, the real estate agent, arrived at the house as usual to check on things. Upon entering, she noticed that the dining room light was on and the newspaper's job section was spread out on the table. Linda walked down the hallway to the bedroom at the end, where she found a girl lying motionless on the bed, seemingly covered with a blanket. Later, the police quickly arrived at the scene. They carefully lifted the blanket, which was almost stuck to the girl's body, only to discover that she was completely naked, with an unknown liquid on her legs, later confirmed to be semen. She had a wound on her forehead, a bruise on her nose, and 3 teeth were knocked out, 2 of which were cruelly hidden in her hair. It was confirmed that the victim was Lisa. Initially, the attacker was given the notorious nickname, the Night Stalker, by police. However, as another serial killer named Richard, who also operated at night, became active in the Los Angeles and San Francisco areas, the police and media changed the attacker's nickname to the original Night Stalker to avoid confusion, based on the chronological order of their crimes. Since 1986, following Lisa's murder, neither the East Area rapist nor the original Night Stalker has committed another crime. Nevertheless, the lives of the victims have not returned to normal. They remain shrouded in fear and unease. On January 2nd, 1978, Phyllis, the first known victim of the East Area rapist, received a phone call in which the caller said, "I'm going to kill you, bitch. Goddamn whore." In 2001, the Sacramento Police Department launched an investigation. They compared the DNA evidence left by the East Area rapist with that left by the original Night Stalker. Ultimately, it was confirmed that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Although decades have passed, the police and the public who followed these cases never gave up. Among them, a full-time mother named Michelle documented a vast amount of case details. She studied the composite sketches of the suspect, searched online daily for clues about this serial killer, and occasionally visited the victims' families to listen to their stories. And it was she who named this mysterious serial killer the Golden State Killer. Michelle was not the only one paying attention to the Golden State Killer. An investigator named Paul had been tracking the Golden State Killer for over 20 years. Despite uncovering a large number of indirect clues, such as the perpetrator's fingerprints, semen samples, and eyewitness testimonies, they were unable to narrow down the investigation due to technological limitations. In his quest to find the killer, Paul even tracked thousands of criminals, all to no avail. However, even Paul could not have imagined that these decades-long cold cases would see a crucial breakthrough thanks to a free website. In 2017, after many recommendations, Paul learned about a website focused on genetic genealogy research. It is well known today's society is in a rapidly changing and fragmented era where people are extremely eager to understand their racial origins and family history. Since there was no threshold fee for this website, a large number of people voluntarily uploaded their DNA data to there. Given the website's vast genetic database, Paul had a bold idea. He wanted to upload the Golden State Killer's DNA sample to the site and conduct a data comparison. Later, he shared this idea with his colleagues. Initially, his colleagues who were well-versed in law opposed it, as it might involve personal privacy and illegal law enforcement issues. However, lawyers gave Paul strong support, pointing out that the website's data had immense value for cracking the case, and that the approach was legal. So, Paul quickly took action. He obtained a well-preserved semen sample from the Ventura County coroner. In December 2017, he created an account, uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA to the website. After a period of waiting, they found a person whose DNA partially matched the Golden State Killer's. Clearly, this person had some blood relationship with the Golden State Killer, or he was the killer's relative. Paul had been fighting for 24 years to capture this serial killer. Once, the number of people he tracked and suspected was countless, and with the help of modern shared analysis technology, his list of suspects gradually narrowed down from millions of people to a single family. Later, by comparing appearance, age, work experience, modus operandi, and psychological profiles, the scope was further narrowed. Finally, they zeroed in on a 72-year-old man, Joseph James D'Angelo. In mid-April 2018, the officers obtained an item discarded by Joseph. After DNA comparison, the old man was confirmed to be the killer. Michelle once wrote a letter to the Golden State Killer. In the end part of the letter, there were a few sentences. "I imagine you alone in a small and dark room. You hear a car pull up to the curb and the engine shut off. You know those footsteps are coming for you. The doorbell rings. You can no longer climb the fence to escape. Take a deep breath, a big gulp of air, and clench your teeth. You can only timidly move step by step toward the ringing doorbell. You once threatened the victim, saying you would be forever silent and disappear into the darkness. Open the door and let's see your face, and this is your end." Fortunately, people have waited for this ending. Sadly, Michelle passed away 2 years before the Golden State Killer was arrested. She did not live to see this ending. The development of all things is often propelled and brought about by their essential causes. The extremely ugly and dark side that Joseph concealed can also be traced back to its origins. For most people, playing with siblings during childhood is a happy and blissful memory. But for Joseph, this period became a painful experience that tormented him for the rest of his life. During one playtime, Joseph found that his 7-year-old sister Connie had disappeared. After searching for a long time, Joseph approached an abandoned warehouse where he witnessed a shocking scene. Two pilots were sexually assaulting a little girl. And the girl who was crying out for help with all her might was his sister Connie, whom he had been looking for. For a child around 10 years old, witnessing such a terrifying scene is undoubtedly a catastrophic psychological shock. And this painful childhood memory took deep root in Joseph's heart. Over time, it gradually transformed into despair and resentment towards real life. Joseph's personality also began to twist and become unpredictable. He started committing minor offenses, such as stealing neighbors' property, pilfering other people's mail, and torturing and killing animals. If the pain of his childhood made Joseph put on a devilish mask of hatred toward society, then his later romantic experiences were the trigger for his revenge against society. After completing his military service, Joseph met a girl named Bonnie, and soon the two fell deeply in love. This relationship gave Joseph a renewed sense of hope and beauty in life. He even announced their engagement in the local newspaper. However, 2 years later, Bonnie got married, and the groom was not Joseph, but a wealthy forensic accountant. In reality, the truth was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. It was not Bonnie who cheated on Joseph. Instead, Joseph had been the villain in this relationship. He abused Bonnie, threatened her with a gun, and even forced her to marry him. Despite all this, the relationship left a deep wound in Joseph's heart. His hatred and jealousy towards Bonnie consumed all his emotions. In many of the homosexual assaults, Joseph would stop during the crime, sobbing and shouting, "I hate you. I hate you, Bonnie." After his arrest, since the statute of limitations for the serial rape cases had expired, Joseph was only charged with 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. On June 29, 2020, as part of a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, he admitted to these crimes. Additionally, Joseph confessed to the burglary and murder he committed in Visalia. Thus, the crimes of the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the original Night Stalker were all connected to one person. These heinous acts, which had once kept countless people awake at night, finally had a definitive attribution. On August 21, 2020, Joseph was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole multiple times in a row. During the trial, after listening to the victim impact statements, Joseph offered a brief apology in the face of the victims and their families' anger and sorrow. He said, "I listened to all of your statements, every single one. I truly am sorry for everyone I hurt." However, is this apology really worth accepting? This is a thought-provoking question. In fact, whether it was the multiple burglaries in Visalia or the serial rapes and murders, when Joseph committed these crimes, he was a police officer, someone who was supposed to protect the public and arrest criminals. For example, when Joseph committed the multiple burglaries in Visalia, he was working as a burglary department police officer in Exeter, just 11 miles away. Later, Joseph's daughter submitted a letter to the court, which, once made public, sparked public discussion and reflection. In part of the letter, she wrote affectionately, "I am Joseph's eldest daughter. The father I know and still know to this day. I could never tell you everything he has done for me because he always put me and my daughter first. And it has always been like this throughout our lives, so there is just so much." This letter is indeed touching, but when we stand in the shoes of the victims, imagine those who were raped and murdered. Their lives might have been better or worse than what Joseph's daughter described. No one knows. But because of Joseph, their lives were taken, their futures were stolen, and their life trajectories were completely altered, never to return to what they once were. Without Joseph, those murdered victims would definitely still be alive.